Chapter 9 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in January 2011. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Part 2. How to Appreciate an Orchestral Concert. Chapter 9. Development of the Orchestra. The appreciation and consequent enjoyment of an orchestral concert will be greatly enhanced if the listener is familiar with certain details regarding the orchestra itself and some of the compositions he is apt to hear. This I have borne in mind in the chapter divisions of this portion of my book, and, as a result, I have divided the subject into the general development of the orchestra, the specific consideration of the principal orchestral instruments, a cursory commentary on certain phases of orchestral music, and a chapter on Richard Strauss, who represents its most advanced aspects. The first music of which we moderns take account was unaccompanied, a cappella, singing for church service. It was composed in the old ecclesiastical modes, which are quite different from our modern scales, and the name which comes most prominently to mind in connection with this beginning of our musical history is that of Palestrina. With the influence of this old church choral music so dominant, there is little wonder that the first efforts to write music for instruments were awkward. It may be said right here that this awkwardness, or rather this lack of knowledge and appreciation of the individual capacity of various instruments, is shown throughout the school of contrapuntal composition, even by Bach. When Bach wrote for orchestral instruments, he did not consider their peculiar tone quality or their capacity for individual expression, but simply their pitch. Which instrument could take up this, that, or the other theme in his contrapuntal score, when he had carried it as high or as low as he could on some other instrument? This is also true of Handel, although in less degree. But just as we have seen that Domenico Scarlatti worked along original lines for the pianoforte and created the germ of the sonata form, while Bach was weaving and plaiting the counterpoint of his suites, partitas and well-tempered clavichord, so in Italy, during a large part of this contrapuntal period, a distinct kind of orchestral music was springing up. Again, just as we have seen that in Italy the pianoforte shook off the trammels of counterpoint when it began to be used as an accompaniment for dramatic recitative in opera, so the instruments in the orchestra, when composers began to use them for operatic accompaniments, were employed more with reference to their individual tone qualities and power of expression. Primitive orchestral efforts. Although, strictly speaking, not the first composer to use orchestral instruments in opera and to display skill in utilizing their individual characteristics, the most important of these early men was Claudio Monteverde, 1568 to 1643. In his Orfeo, which he produced in 1608, he utilized, besides two harpsichords, and it may be of interest to note here that instruments of the pianoforte class were long used in orchestras as connecting links between all the other instruments, two bass viols, two tenor viols, one double harp, two little French violins, two large guitars, two wood organs, two viola di gambas, one regal, four trombones, two cornets, one octave flute, one clarion, and three trumpets with mutes, a fairly formidable array of instruments when the period is considered. Of especial interest are the two little French violins, which probably were the same as our modern violins, now the prima donnas of the orchestra and far outnumbering any other instrument employed. It was Monteverde who in his Tancredi e Clorinda made use for the first time of a tremolo for stringed instruments, and it is said so to have astonished the performers that they at first refused to play it. Before Monteverde, there were operatic composers like Jacopo Peri, and after him Cavalli and Alessandro Scarlatti, who did much for their day to develop the orchestra. This is a very brief summary of the early development of instrumental music, a story that easily could fill a volume, which probably, however, very few people would take the trouble to read. Beethoven and the modern orchestra. The first really modern composer for the orchestra was Joseph Haydn, 1732 to 1809, who also may be considered the father of the symphony. Born before Mozart, he also survived that composer. His music is gay and naive, while Mozart, although he had decidedly greater genius for the dramatic than Haydn, nevertheless is only a trifle more emotional in his symphonies. The three greatest of these which he composed during the summer of 1788, the E-flat major, G minor, and C major, known as the Jupiter, show a decided advance in the knowledge of orchestration, and the E-flat major is notable because it is the first symphonic work in which clarinets were used. Haydn's and Mozart's symphonies, that is, the best of them, sound agreeable even today in a concert hall of moderate size. But because modern music with its sonorous orchestra requires large auditoriums, like Carnegie Hall in New York, these charming symphonic works of the earlier classical period are swallowed up in space, and much of their naive and pretty effect is lost. Beethoven may be said to have established the modern orchestra. Very few instruments have been added to it since his time, and if an orchestra today sounds differently from what it did in his day, if the works of modern composers sound richer and more effective from a modern point of view than his orchestral compositions, it is not because we have added a lot of new instruments, but because our composers have acquired greater skill in bringing out their peculiar tone qualities, and because the technique of orchestral players has greatly improved. It is for precisely the same reasons that Beethoven's symphonies show such a great advance upon those of his predecessors. The point is not that Beethoven added a few more instruments to the orchestra, but that, so far as his own purposes were concerned, he handled all the instruments which he included in his band with much greater skill than his predecessors had shown. Many writers affect to despise technique, but in point of fact the development of technique and the development of art go hand in hand. An artist, be he writer, painter, or musician, cannot adequately express his ideas unless he has the means of doing so, or the genius to create the means. How he developed orchestral resources. In following Beethoven's symphonies from the first to the ninth, we can see the modern orchestra developing under his hands from that handed over to him by Haydn and Mozart. In the first and second symphonies, Beethoven employs the usual strings, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, 2 trumpets, and timpani. In the third symphony, the Eroica, he adds a third horn part. In the fifth, a piccolo, trombones, and contrabassoon. Although employed in the finale only, these instruments here make their first bow in the symphonic orchestra. In the ninth symphony, Beethoven introduced 2 additional horns, the first use of 4 horns in a symphony. The scoring of these symphonies is given somewhat more in detail in the chapter How the Orchestra Grew, in Mr. W. J. Henderson's The Orchestra and Orchestral Music, a well-conceived and logically developed book, in which the full story of the orchestra and its growth is clearly and interestingly told. Beethoven not only understood to a greater degree than his predecessors the peculiar characteristics of orchestral instruments, he also compelled orchestral players to acquire a better technique by giving them more difficult music to execute. In point of greater difficulty in performance, a Beethoven symphony holds about the same relation to the symphonies of Mozart and Haydn as the Beethoven pianoforte sonatas do to the sonatas of those composers. Beethoven and Wagner. Just as Beethoven added only a few instruments to the orchestra of his predecessors, but showed greater skill in handling those instruments, so the modern musician, a Wagner or Richard Strauss, achieves his striking instrumental effects by a still greater knowledge of instrumental resources. The Beethoven orchestra practically is the orchestra of today. Few, very few instruments have been added. Modern composers steadily have asked for more and more instruments in each group, but that is quite a different thing from adding new instruments. They have required more instruments of the same kind, but have asked for very few instruments of new kinds. Let me illustrate this by two modern examples. Firm, compact, and eloquent as is Beethoven's orchestra in the Fifth Symphony, it cannot for a moment be compared in richness, sonority, tone color, searching power of expression, and unflagging interest with Wagner's orchestra in Die Meistersinger. Yet Wagner has added only one trumpet, a harp, and a tuba to the very orchestra which Beethoven employed when he scored for the Fifth Symphony, while for his Symphonie Pathétique, one of the finest of modern orchestral works, Tchaikovsky adds only a bass tuba to the orchestra used by Beethoven. The simple fact is that modern composers have studied every possible phase of tone color and expression of which each instrument is capable. Furthermore, by skillfully dividing the orchestra into groups and using these groups like separate orchestras, yet uniting them into one great orchestra, they produce wonderfully rich contrapuntal effects, and thus make the modern orchestra sound, not 75 years, but 500 years more advanced than that of Beethoven, however great we gladly acknowledge Beethoven to have been. Berlioz, an orchestral juggler. Following Beethoven, the next great development in the handling of orchestral resources is due to Hector Berlioz, 1803 to 1869, and it is curious here how nearly one musical epoch overlaps another. Scarlatti was composing sonatas, and thus voicing the beginning of the classical era, while Bach was bringing the contrapuntal period to a close. It was only 5 years after the completion of the Ninth Symphony that Berlioz's Franz Juge overture was played. A year later his Symphonie Fantastique, Épisode de la vie d'un artiste, was brought out. Yet, the Berlioz orchestra sounds so utterly different from the Beethoven orchestra that it almost might be a collection of different instruments. Even more than Beethoven, Berlioz understood the individuality, the potential characteristics of each instrument. Berlioz composed on a colossal scale, so colossal that his music has been called architectural. The Dies Irae in his Requiem calls for 4 brass bands in 4 different corners of the hall, and for 14 kettle drums tuned to different notes, in addition to the regular orchestra, chorus, and soloists. This has been dubbed 3-story music, the orchestra on the ground floor, the chorus on the bel étage, while the 4 extra brass bands are stationed au troisième. Unfortunately for Berlioz, his ambition, insofar as it related to the art of orchestration and the skill he showed in accomplishing what he wanted to with his body of instrumentalists, was far in excess of his inspiration. His knowledge of the orchestra was sufficient to have afforded him every facility of the expression of great thoughts, if he had them to express. But his power of thematic invention, his gift for melody, was not equal to his genius for instrumentation. Nevertheless, through this genius for instrumentation, for his technique was so extraordinary that it amounted to genius, and through his very striving after bizarre, unusual, and gigantic effects, he contributed largely toward the development of the technical resources of instrumental music. Wagner, greatest of orchestral composers. Berlioz wrote a book on instrumentation, which has lately been re-edited by Richard Strauss. In it, Strauss, modestly ignoring himself, says that Wagner's scores mark the only advance in orchestration worth mentioning since Berlioz. It is true the technical possibilities of the orchestra were greatly improved, so far as the woodwind was concerned, by the introduction of keyed instruments constructed on the system invented by Theobald Böhm, while the French instrument maker, Adolphe Sax, also made important improvements by perfecting the bass clarinet and the bass tuba. But whatever aid Wagner derived from these improvements merely was incidental to the principle which is illustrated by every one of his scores, that technique merely is a means to an end. Wagner is the greatest orchestral virtuoso who ever breathed. Never, however, does he employ technique for technique's sake, but always only to enable his orchestra to convey the exact meaning he has in his mind, or express the emotion he has in his heart, and he spares no pains to hit upon the best method of conveying these ideas and expressing these emotions. That is one reason why, although no one with any knowledge of music could mistake a passage by Wagner for anyone else's music, each of his works has its own peculiar orchestral style. For each of his works reproduces through the orchestra the atmosphere of his subject. The scores of Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, The Ring of the Nibelung, Tristan, Meistersinger, and Parsifal never could be mistaken for anyone but Wagner's music. Yet how different they are from each other! He makes each instrument speak its own language. When, for example, the English horn speaks through Wagner, it speaks English, not broken English, and so it is with all the other instruments of the orchestra. He makes them speak without a foreign accent. If Wagner employs a large orchestra, it is not for the sake of making a noise, but in order to gain variety in expression. He is wonderfully reserved in the use of his forces, says Richard Strauss. He employs them as a great general would his battalions, and does not send in an army corps to pick off a skirmisher. Strauss regards Lohengrin as a model score for a somewhat advanced student, before proceeding to the polyphony of Tristan and Meistersinger, or the fairy region of the Nibelungs. The handling of the wind instruments, writes Strauss, quote, reaches a hitherto unknown aesthetic height. The so-called third woodwinds, English horn and bass clarinet, aided for the first time to the woodwinds, are already employed in a variety of tone color, the voices of the second, third, and fourth horn, trumpets and trombones established in an independent polyphony, the doubling of melodic voices characteristic of Wagner, carried out with such assurance and freedom and knowledge of their characteristic timbres, and worked out with an understanding of tonal beauty that to this day evokes unstinted admiration. At the close of the second act, the organ tones that Wagner lures out of the orchestra triumph over the queen of instruments herself. End quote. How Wagner produces his effects. The effects produced by Wagner are not due to a large orchestra, but to his manner of using the instruments in it. Among some of his special effects are the employment of full harmony with what formerly would have been merely single passing notes, and, above all, the exploitation of every resource of counterpoint in combination with the well-developed system of harmony inherited from Beethoven, but largely added to by himself. In fact, Wagner's greatness is due to the combination of several great gifts, his melodic inventiveness, his rich harmony, and his wonderful technical skill in weaving together his themes in a still richer counterpoint. This counterpoint is not, however, dry and formal, because his themes, his leading motives, are themselves full of emotional significance, and not conceived, like those of the old contrapuntists, merely for formal treatment. Richard Strauss is such a master of orchestration that I am inclined to quote his summary of the development of the art of orchestration from his edition of the Berlioz book, which at this writing has not yet been translated. I should like to recall to the reader's mind, however, the fact that Strauss' father was a noted French horn player, that Strauss himself has a great love for the instrument, and that when, in summing up the causes of Wagner's primacy among orchestral writers, he finds one of them in the greater technical facility of the valve horn, it is well to take this with a grain of salt and attribute it somewhat to his own affection for the instrument. The symphonies of Haydn and Mozart, according to Strauss, are enlarged string quartets with obbligato woodwind, brass and timpani, and the occasional use of other instruments of noise to strengthen the tuttes. Quote, "Even with Beethoven, the symphony is still simply enlarged chamber music, the orchestra being treated in a pianistic spirit which unfortunately shows itself even in the orchestral work of Schumann and Brahms. Wagner owes his polyphonic string quintet not to the Beethoven orchestra, but to the last quartets of Beethoven, in which each instrument is the peer of the others. Meanwhile, another kind of orchestral work was developing, for, from the time of Gluck on, the opera orchestra was gaining in coloring and in individual characteristics. Berlioz was not dramatic enough for opera, nor symphonic enough for the concert stage, yet his efforts to write programmatic symphonies resulted in his discovering new effects, new possibilities in tone tints and in orchestral techniques. Berlioz misses the polyphony that enriches Wagner's orchestra, and makes instruments like the second violins, violas, etc., second horns, etc., weave their threads or strands of melody into the woof. Wagner's primacy is due to his employment of the richest style of polyphony and counterpoint, the increased possibility of this through the invention of the valve horn, and his demand of solo virtuosity upon his orchestral players. His scores mark the only advance worth mentioning since Berlioz. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 10. Instruments of the Orchestra. An orchestra is an aggregation of many instruments which, under the baton of an able conductor, should play as one, so far as precision and expression are concerned. Separately, the instruments are like the paints on a palette, and the result of the composer's effort, like that of the painter's, depends on what he has to express, and his knowledge of how to use his materials in trying to express it. The orchestra has developed into several distinct groups, which are capable of playing independently, or in union with each other, and within these groups themselves there are various subdivisions. It is the purpose of every modern composer who amounts to anything to get as many different quartets as possible out of his orchestra. By this is meant a grouping of instruments in such a way that as many groups as possible can play in independent harmony. It is through this system of orchestral groups that Wagner has been able to enrich orchestral tone coloring, and to say everything he wishes to say in exactly the way it should be said. We cannot, for example, imagine that the love motive in Die Walküre could be made to sound more beautiful on its first entrance in the score than it does. Nor could it. In that scene it is exactly suited to a solo violoncello, and to a solo violoncello Wagner gives it. In order, however, to produce a perfectly homogeneous effect, in order that the violoncello quality of tone shall pervade not only the melody, but also the supporting harmony, he supports the melody with 8 violoncellos, adding 2 double basses to give more sonorousness to the deepest note in the harmony. In other words, he has made for the moment a complete orchestra out of 9 violoncellos and 2 double basses, and produced a wondrously rich and thrilling effect, because, having a beautiful melody to score, he knew just the instruments for which to score it. This is an admirable example of what technique accomplishes in the hands of a genius. Another composer might have used an orchestra of 100 instruments, and not have produced the exquisite thrill that Wagner, with his magical orchestral touch, conjures out of this group of violoncellos, a group within a group, an orchestra of violoncellos within the string band. The woodwind instruments are capable of several similar subdivisions. Flutes, oboes, and bassoons, for example, may form a group capable of producing independent harmony. So can the clarinets, and the same is the case with the brass instruments. One of Wagner's most beautiful leading motives, the Walhalla motive in the Ring of the Nibelung, is sounded on 4 trombones. In brief, then, the modern composer strives to constitute his orchestra in such a way that he secures as many independent groups and as many little orchestras as possible, not, however, for the purpose of using them independently all the time, but merely in order to do so occasionally for special effects or to combine them whenever he sees fit, in order to enrich his tone coloring or weave his polyphony. The grand divisions of the orchestra are the strings, violins, violas, violoncellos, and double basses; the woodwind, consisting, broadly speaking, of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons; the brass, horns, trumpets, and trombones; and the instruments of percussion, or the battery, drums, triangles, cymbals, and instruments of that kind. The prima donna of the orchestra. The leading instrument of the string group, and, in fact, the leading instrument of the orchestra, is the violin. The first violins are the prima donnas of the orchestra, and one might say that it is almost impossible to have too many of them. The first and second violins should form about 1/3 of an orchestra, and better still it would be for the number to exceed that proportion. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, which has about 81 players, has 30 violins. Theodore Thomas's New York Festival Orchestra in 1882, consisting of 314 instruments, had 100 violins. Great is the capacity of the violin. Its notes may be crisp, sharp, decisive, brilliant, or long drawn out and full of emotion. It has greater precision of attack than any other instrument in the orchestra. And right here it is interesting to note that while the multiplication of instruments gives greater sonority, it also gives much finer effects in soft passages. The pianissimo of 100 violins is a very much finer pianissimo, and at the same time infinitely richer and further carrying than the pianissimo of a solo violin. It is the very acme of a musical stage whisper. In this very first and most important group of the orchestra we can find examples of utilizing subdivisions of groups. Although the violin cannot be played lower than its G string, which sounds the G below the treble clef, the violin group nevertheless has been employed entirely by itself, and even subdivided within itself. The most exquisite example of this, one cited in every work on the orchestra worth reading, is the Lohengrin Prelude. To this the violins were divided into 4 groups and on the highest register, with an effect that is most ethereal. Modern orchestral virtuosity may be gauged by the statement that, while Beethoven but once dared to score for his violins above the high F, Richard Strauss, in the most casual manner, carries them an octave higher. A little contrivance of wood or metal with teeth can be pressed down over the strings of the violin, so as to deaden its vibrations. This is called the sordine, or mute. A famous example of the use of violins con sordini is the Queen Mab scherzo in Berlioz's Romeo et Juliette Symphonie. Another well-known use of the same effect is in Asa's Death in Grieg's Peer Gynt suite. Nothing can be more exquisite than the entrance of the muted violins after a long silence in the last act of Tristan und Isolde, just before Isolde intones the love-death. An unusual effect is produced by using the back of the bow instead of the horsehair. Liszt uses it in his symphonic poem Mazeppa, for imitating the snorting of a horse; Wagner, in Siegfried, for accompanying the mocking laugh of Mime; and Richard Strauss in Feuersnot, to produce the effect of crackling flames. But, as Strauss remarks in his revision of Berlioz's work on instrumentation, it is effective only with a large orchestra. The plucking of the strings with the fingers, pizzicato, is a familiar device. Tchaikovsky employed it almost throughout an entire movement, the pizzicato ostinato, in his Fourth Symphony. Viola, violoncello, and double bass. The viola is a deeper violin, with a very beautiful and expressive tone. Méhul, the French composer, scored his one-act opera, Uthal, without violins, employing the viola as the highest string instrument in his score. This, however, was not a success, the brilliant tone of the violin being missed more and more as the performance of the work progressed, until Grétry is said to have risen in his seat and exclaimed, "1,000 francs for an E string!" Meyerbeer, who was among the first to appreciate the beauty of the viola as a solo instrument, used a single viola for the accompaniment to Raoul's romance Plus blanche que la blanche hermine, in the first act of Les Huguenots. Strictly speaking, he wrote it for the viola d'amour, which is somewhat larger than the ordinary viola, but it almost always is played on the latter. Berlioz made exquisite use of it in his Harold Symphony, practically making a dramatis persona of it, for in the score a solo viola represents the melancholy wanderer, and in his Don Quixote, Richard Strauss assigns the instrument to an equally important role. The violoncello is one of the most tenderly expressive of all the instruments in the orchestra. Beethoven employs it for the theme of the slow movement in his Fifth Symphony, and although the viola joins with the violoncello in playing this melody, the passage owes its beauty chiefly to the latter. One of the most exquisite melodies in all symphonic music is the theme which Schubert has given to the violoncellos in the first movement of his unfinished symphony. They are also used with wonderfully expressive effect in the Tristan Vorspiel. Rossini gives a melodious passage in the introduction to the overture to William Tell to 5 violoncellos. But the most striking employment of the violoncellos as an independent group is in the love motive in the first act of Die Walküre. Double basses were first used to simply double the violoncello part in the harmony, but through Beethoven's employment of them in the Fifth and Ninth Symphonies, in the former for a remarkably effective passage in the scherzo, and in the latter for a highly dramatic recitative, their importance as independent instruments in the orchestra was established. Verdi has made very effective use of them in the scene in Othello as the Moor approaches Desdemona's bed. In the introduction to Rheingold, Wagner has half his double basses tuned down to E flat, which is half a note deeper than the usual range of the instrument, and in the second act of Tristan und Isolde, 2 basses are obliged to tune their E string down to C sharp. Dividing the string band. I have pointed out several examples in which the groups of instruments in the string band are divided within themselves, as in the prelude to Lohengrin and in the first act of Die Walküre. The entire string band can be divided and subdivided with telling effect when done by a master. When, in the second act of Tristan, Brangäne warns the lovers from her position on the watchtower, the accompaniment stirs the soul to its depth, because it gives the listener such a weird thrill of impending danger that he almost longs to inform the lovers of their peril. In this passage, Wagner divides the string band into no less than 15 parts. In the thunderstorm in Rheingold, the strings are divided into 21 parts. Richard Strauss points out how, in the introduction to Die Walküre, much of the stormy effect is produced by strings only, 16 second violins, 12 violas, 12 violoncellos, and 4 double basses, a storm for strings, where another composer would have unleashed a whole orchestra, including cymbals and bass drum, and crashed and thrashed about without producing a tithe of Wagner's effect. He also cites the tremolo at the beginning of the second act of Tristan as a wonderful example of tone painting, which produces the effect of whispering foliage and conveys to the audience a sense of mystery and danger. Theodore Thomas always was insistent that the various divisions of a string band should bow exactly alike. It is said that he once stopped an orchestra because he had detected something wrong with the tonal effect, and, after watching the players, had discovered that one violoncellist among 16 was bowing differently from the others. Richard Strauss, on the other hand, never insists on the same bowing throughout each division of strings. He thinks it robs the melody of intensity and beauty if each individual is not allowed to play according to his own peculiar temperament. A passage in Die Walküre. In the magic fire scene in the finale of Die Walküre, Wagner wrote violin passages which not even the greatest soloist can play cleanly, yet which, when played by all the violins, simulate in sound the aspect of licking, circling flames. Indeed, the effects that Wagner understood how to draw from the orchestral instruments are little short of marvelous. In the Lohengrin prelude, the tone quality of the violins is absolutely angelic in purity, while in the third act of Siegfried, the upswinging violin passages, as the young hero reaches the height where Brünnhilde slumbers, depict the action with a thrilling realism. Besides the regular string band, Wagner made frequent use of the harp. It is related that at the Munich performance of Rheingold, when the harpist Trombo protested to him that some of the passages were unplayable, the composer replied, "You don't expect me to play the harp too, do you?" You perceive the general effect I am aiming at. Produce that, and I shall be satisfied. Liszt, in his Dante Symphony, uses the glissando of the harp as a symbol for the rising shades of Francesco di Rimini and her lover, and a very beautiful use of harmonics on the harp, with their faint tinkle, is to be found in the Waltz of the Sylphs in Berlioz's Damnation de Faust. The woodwind. Flutes, oboes, and clarinets form the woodwind. One of the best-known passages for flute is in the Third Leonora Overture of Beethoven, where it is employed with conspicuous grace. Probably, however, more fun has been made of the flute than of any other orchestral instrument, and a standard musical joke runs as follows. Are you musical? No, but I have a brother who plays the flute. It has also been insinuated that in Donizetti's Lucia the heroine goes mad, not because she has been separated from Edgardo, but because a flute obbligato accompanies her principal aria. The piccolo is a high flute, used for shrill effects. The instruments of both the oboe and clarinet families are reed instruments, with this difference, however. The instruments of the oboe family have 2 vibrating reeds in the mouthpieces, those of the clarinet family only 1. The oboe family consists of the oboe proper, the English horn, which is an alt oboe, and the bassoon, which is the bass of this group of instruments. In Italian the bassoon is called a fagotto, a name derived from its supposed resemblance to a bundle of fagots. Candor, artless grace, tender joy, or the grief of a fragile soul are found in the oboe's accents, says Berlioz of this instrument, and those who remember the exquisite oboe melody with which the slow movement of Schubert's C major symphony opens, will agree with the French composer. Richard Strauss, in his Sinfonia Domestica, employs the almost obsolete oboes d'amore to represent an innocent, dreamy, playful child. The English horn in Tristan. The most famous use of the English horn is found in the 3rd act of Tristan, where it plays the sad lay while Tristan awaits the news of the ship which is bearing Isolde toward him, and changes to a joyous strain when the ship is sighted. The bassoon and contrabassoon, besides their value as the bass of the oboe family, have certain humorous qualities, which are admirably brought out in Beethoven's 5th and 9th symphonies, and in the March of the Clownish Artisans, in Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream music. In opera, Meyerbeer made the bassoon famous by his scoring of the dance of the Spectre Nuns in Robert le Diable for it, and he also used it for the accompaniment of the female chorus in the 2nd act of Les Huguenots. The theme of the romanza, Una furtiva lagrima, in Donizetti's L'Elésir d'Amore, which Caruso sings so beautifully, is introduced by the bassoon, and with charming effect. The clarinets have a large compass. Usually 3 kinds of clarinets, in A, B flat, and C, because they are transposing instruments, are employed in the orchestra, besides the bass clarinet. The possibilities of the clarinet group have been enormously developed by Wagner. It is necessary only to recall the scene of Elsa's bridal procession to the cathedral in the 2nd act of Lohengrin, Elizabeth's sad exit after her prayer in the 3rd act of Tannhäuser, in which the melody is played by the bass clarinet, while the accompaniment is given to 3 flutes and 8 other clarinets. The change of scene in the 1st act of Götterdämmerung, when clarinets give forth the Brünnhilde motive, and passages in the 2nd act of Die Meistersinger, in the scene at nightfall, while for a generally skillful use of the woodwind, the introduction to the 3rd act of Lohengrin is a shining example. Brass instruments. People usually associate the brass instruments with noise, but as a matter of fact, wonderfully rich and soft tone effects can be produced on the brass by a composer who knows how to score for it. Just as the pianissimo of many violins is a finer pianissimo than that of a solo violin, so a much more exquisitely soft effect can be produced on a large brass group than on a few brass instruments or a single one. When modern composers increase the number of instruments in the brass group, it is not for the sake of noise, but for richer effects. The trumpet is the soprano of the brass family. The fanfare in Fidelio, when at the crucial moment aid approaches, the Siegfried motive and the sword motive in the Ring of the Nibelung, need only to be cited to prove the effectiveness of the instrument in its proper place, and Richard Strauss instances the demoniacal and fateful effect of the deep trumpet tones in the introduction to the 1st act of Bizet's Carmen. Although the notes of the trombone are produced by a slide, this instrument belongs to the trumpet family. For this reason, in the Ring of the Nibelung, Wagner, in addition to the usual 3 tenor trombones, reintroduced the almost obsolete bass trombone. He wanted a trombone group complete in itself, and thus to be able to utilize the peculiar tone color of the instrument, as witness in the Walhalla motive, where it is scored for the 3 tenor trombones and bass trombone, resulting in a wonderfully rich and velvety quality of tone. Excepting Wagner and Richard Strauss, there probably is not a composer who would not have used the bass tuba here instead of taking the trouble to revive the bass trombone. But Wagner wanted an unusually rich tone, which should be solemn without a trace of somberness, and his keen instrumental color sense informed him that he could secure it with the bass trombone, which, as it belongs to the trumpet family, has a touch of trumpet brilliancy, whereas the tone of the bass tuba is darker. Mozart employed the trombone with fine effect in Sarastro's solo in the Magic Flute. Schubert showed his genius for instrumentation by the manner in which he used them in the introduction to his C major symphony, as well as in the first movement of that symphony, in which a theme is given out by 3 trombones in unison. And another familiar example of good scoring for trombones is in the introduction to the third act of Lohengrin. In the death prophecy scene in the second act of Die Walküre, a trumpet melody is supported by the 4 trombones, another instance of Wagner's sense of homogeneity in sound, since trumpets and trombones belong to the same family. In fact, throughout the Ring, as Strauss points out, Wagner wrote for his trombones in 4 parts, adding the bass trombone, in order to differentiate wholly between it and the tuba, which latter he used with the horns, with which it is properly grouped. Wagner has a tremendous tuba recitative in a Faust overture, and in the Funeral March in the Götterdämmerung he introduces tenor tubas in order again to differentiate between the tone color of tubas and trombones, and not to be obliged to employ trombones in this particular scene, the general tone color of the tuba being far more somber than that of the trombone. Richard Strauss's Tribute to the Horn. To mention tubas and trombones before the horns is very much like putting the cart before the horse, but I have reserved the horns for the last of the brass, on account of the great tribute which Richard Strauss has paid them. In the early orchestras one rarely found more than 2 horns. Beethoven used 4 in the Ninth Symphony, and now it is not at all unusual to find 8. Of all instruments, says Richard Strauss, the horn is perhaps the one that best can be joined with other groups. To substantiate this in all its numerous phases, I should be obliged to quote the entire Meistersinger score. For I do not think I exaggerate when I maintain that the greatly developed technique of the valve horn has made it possible that a score which, with the addition of a third trumpet, a harp, and a tuba, employs the same instruments as Beethoven used in his Fifth Symphony, has become with every bar something entirely different, something wholly new and unheard of. Surely the 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons of Mozart have been exhausted by Wagner in every direction of their technical possibilities and plastically combined with an almost weird perception of all their tone secrets. The string quintet, through the most refined divisions into parts, and with added brilliance through the employment of the harp, produces innumerable new tone effects, and by superb polyphony is brought to a height and warmth of emotional expression such as never before was dreamed of. Trumpet and trombones are made to express every phase of solemn or humorous characterization, but the main thing is the tireless participation of the horn, now for the melody, now for filling out, now as bass. The Meistersinger score is the horn's hymn of praise. Through the introduction and perfection of the valve horn, the greatest improvement in the technique of scoring since Berlioz's day has been made possible. To illustrate exhaustively this protean character of the horn, I should like, again, to go through the scores of the great magician, bar by bar, beginning with Rheingold. Whether it rings through the primeval German forest, with the sunny exuberance of Siegfried's youthful heart and joy of living, whether in Liszt's Mazeppa it dies out in the last hoarse gasp of the Cossack prince nigh unto death in the vast desert of the steppes, whether it conjures the childlike longing of Siegfried for the mother he never has known, whether it hovers over the gently undulating sea which is to bring Isolde's gladdening form to the dying Tristan, or nods Hans Sachs thanks to the faithful prentice, whether in Eric's dream it causes in a few hollow accents the North Sea to break on the lonely coast, bestows upon the apples of Freya the gift of eternal youth, pokes fun at the curtain heroes, Meistersinger, Act 3, plies the cudgels on Beckmesser with the jealous David and his comrades, and is the real instigator of the riot, or sings in veiled notes of the wounds of Tristan, always the horn, in its place and to be relied on, responds, unique in its manifold meanings and its brilliant significance. Famous horn passages in the works of other composers are in the trio of the scherzo in the Eroica Symphony, in the second movement of Schubert's C major Symphony, the passage of which Schumann said that the notes of the horns just before the return of the principal subject were like the voice of an angel, in the opening of Weber's Freischütz Overture, in the introduction to Michaela's Romance in Carmen, and in the opening theme of the slow movement of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, which is the perfection of a melodic phrase for solo horn. Instruments of percussion. In the battery, the instruments of prime importance are the timpani. Beethoven gave the cue to what could be accomplished with these in the scherzo of the Fifth Symphony, and also in the octave thumps in the scherzo of the Ninth Symphony, while for a weirdly somber effect there is nothing equal to the faint roll of the timpani at the beginning and end of the Funeral March in Götterdämmerung. Cymbals are used in several ways. Besides the ordinary clash, Wagner has produced a sound somewhat like that of a gong by the sharp stroke of a drumstick on one cymbal, and also a roll by using a pair of drumsticks on one cymbal. Among composers since Beethoven, Weber, Liszt, Saint-Saëns, Dvorak, Tchaikovsky, and of course Richard Strauss, it is hardly necessary to mention either Berlioz or Wagner again, have shown brilliant technique in orchestration. On the other hand, Schumann and Brahms do not appear to have understood or to have taken the trouble to understand the individual characteristics of orchestral instruments, and, as a result, their works for orchestra are not as effective as they should be. Their orchestrations have been called muddy. It is Richard Strauss's opinion that the next advancement in orchestration will be brought about by adding largely to certain groups of instruments which now have only comparatively few representatives in the orchestra. He instances that at the Brussels Conservatory one of the professors had Mozart's G Symphony performed for him on 22 clarinets, of which 4 were basset horns, alto clarinets, 2 bass clarinets, and 1 contrabass clarinet, and he suggests that it will be along such lines that the orchestra of the future will be enlarged. With an orchestra with all the family groups of instruments complete in the manner suggested by Strauss, and used by a musical genius, a genius who combines with melodic invention virtuosity of instrumentation, marvelous results are yet to be achieved. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa.
Chapter 11 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 11. Concerning Symphonies. I have said that music, like all other arts, had a somewhat formless beginning, then gradually acquired form, then became too rigidly formal, and in modern times, while not discarding form, has become freer in its expression of emotion. Instrumental music, since the beginning of the classical period, has been governed largely by the symphony, which the reader should bear in mind is nothing more than a sonata for orchestra, the form having first developed on the pianoforte and having been handed over by it to the aggregation of instruments. Sir Hubert Parry, from whose book The Evolution of the Art of Music I have had previous occasion to quote, has several apt paragraphs concerning the earlier development of the sonata, which of course apply with equal force to the symphony. After stating that the instinct of the composers, who first sought the liberation of music from the all-predominating counterpoint, impelled them to develop movements of wider and freer range, which should admit of warm melodic expression, without degenerating into incoherent, rambling ecstasy, Sir Hubert continues, quote, "They had the sense to see from the first that mere formal continuous melody is not the most suitable type for instrumental music. There is deep-rooted in the matter of all instrumental music the need of some rhythmic vitality. These composers then set themselves to devise a scheme in which, to begin with, the contour of connected melodic phrases, supported and defined by simple harmonic accompaniment, gave the impression of definite tonality, that is, of being decisively in some particular key and giving an unmistakable indication of it. They found out how to proceed by giving the impression of using that key without departing from the characteristic spirit and mood of the music, as shown in the subjects and figures, and how to give the impression of relative completeness by closing in a key which is in strong contrast to the first, and so round off one half of the design. But this point being in opposition to the starting point, leaves the mind dissatisfied and in expectation of fresh disclosures, so they made the balance complete by resuming the subjects and melodic figures of the first part in extraneous keys and working back to the starting point, and they made their final close with the same figures as were used to conclude the first half, but in the principal key instead of the key of contract." This is a somewhat more elaborate method of describing the sonata form than I have adopted in the division of this book relating to the pianoforte. Aesthetic purpose of the symphony. Later on in his book, Sir Hubert, in discussing the type of sonata movement which was fairly established by the time of Haydn and Mozart, gives a simpler aesthetic explanation, pointing out that the first part of the movement aims at definiteness of subject, definiteness of contrast of keys, definiteness of regular balancing groups of bars and rhythms, definiteness of progressions. By the time this first division is over, the mind has had enough of such definiteness and wants a change. The second division, therefore, represents the breaking up of the subjects into their constituent elements of figure and rhythm, the obliteration of the sense of regularity by grouping the bars irregularly, and aims, by moving constantly from key to key, to give the sense of artistic confusion, which, however, is always regulated by some inner but disguised principle of order. When the mind has gone through enough of the pleasing sense of bewilderment, the sense that has made riddles attractive to the human creature from time immemorial, the scheme is completed by resuming the orderly methods of the first division and firmly re-establishing the principal theme which has been carefully avoided since the commencement. The earlier symphonic writers usually wrote their symphonies in 3 movements: the first or sonata movement, a second slow movement in a simpler type of form, usually of the song, aria or rondo type, and a final movement in lively time, also usually adapted to the rondo form. Concerning this 3-movement symphony of the early writers, it was said by an old-time wit that they wrote the first movement to show what they could do, the second movement to show what they could feel, and the third movement to show how glad they were it was over, and this may be said to describe the view of the ultra-modern music lover toward rigidity of form in general. Regarding form in music, there is much prejudice one way or the other. The sonnet in poetry certainly is a rigid form, and yet those poets who have mastered it have produced extremely effective and highly artistic poems, and poems abounding in profound emotional expression. Walt Whitman, on the other hand, was quite formless, and yet he is sure to be ranked in time as one of the greatest poets of his age. Wagner's idea was that the symphonic form had reached its climax with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Yet it is by no means incredible that if Wagner in his maturer years had undertaken to compose a symphony, the result would have disproved his own theory. Seems to hamper modern composers. The symphonic form, however, or, to be more exact, the sonata form, seems to hamper every modern composer when he writes for the pianoforte, and the fact that most of Beethoven's pianoforte music was written in this form appears to be the reason for his works somewhat falling into disuse. On the other hand, the form is undoubtedly holding out better in the orchestral version of the sonata, the symphony, because the tone color of orchestral instruments gives it greater variety. Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, and Brahms have worked successfully, and the 2 former even brilliantly, in this form. And if Brahms in his symphonies appears too continent, too classically reserved, it would seem to be not so much the form itself which is to blame, as his lack of skill in instrumentation. My own personal preference is for the freer form developed by Liszt in the symphonic poem, in which a leading motive, or possibly several motives skillfully varied, dominate the whole composition and give it aesthetic and psychological unity, and for the still freer development of instrumental music in the tone poem of Richard Strauss. But neither the symphonic poems of Liszt nor the tone poems of Strauss are formless music. That should be well understood, although it should be borne in mind with equal distinctness that these manifestations of the genius of two great composers show a complete liberation from the shackles of the classical symphony. In the end, the test is found in the music itself. If the music of a symphonic poem which sets out to express a given title or a given motto, if the music of a tone poem which starts out to interpret a programmatic story or device, is worthy to be ranked with the great productions of the art, it not only is profoundly interesting as music, but gains immensely in interest through its incidental secondary meaning. It is the old story of art for art's sake, art for the purpose of merely gratifying the eye or the ear, or art for the purpose of conveying something besides itself to the beholder or the listener. And it seems to me that, in the history of the art for art's sake has always been the more primitive expression, and eventually has been obliged to give way. The naive symphonists. At the risk of repeating what already has been said of the sonata, the symphony may be described as a work in 4 movements. The first movement, usually an allegro, sometimes with a slow introduction, but more frequently without one. A second movement, ordinarily called the slow movement, and usually in adagio or andante. A third movement, either minuet or scherzo, and a final movement in fast time and usually in rondo form. It was Haydn who pretty definitely established these divisions of the symphony. He composed in all 125 symphonies, of which only a few appear on modern concert programs, and even these but occasionally. Their music is marked by a simplicity bordering on naivete, and the orchestration is a string quartet with a mere filling out by other instruments. Mozart was of a deeper and more dramatic nature than Haydn, and the expression of his thought was more intense. In the same way, there is a greater warmth and color in his orchestration. Nevertheless, the 3 finest of his 49 symphonies, the E-flat, G minor, and Jupiter, composed in 1788, seem almost childlike in their artless grace and beauty to us moderns. Beethoven's first 2 symphonies were written under the influence of Haydn and Mozart, but with the third he becomes distinctly epic in his musical utterance, and this symphony, both in regard to variety and depth of expression and skillful use of orchestral instruments, is as great an advance upon the work of his predecessors as, let us say, Tchaikovsky is upon Mendelssohn. Beethoven to the fore. There are apparent in the sequences of Beethoven's symphonies certain climaxes and certain rests. Thus, the third is the climax of the first 3. The fourth is far less profound, the master relaxes. But the fifth, with its compact, vigorous theme, which Beethoven himself is said to have described as fate knocking at the door, and his skillful introduction of this theme in varied form in each of the movements, is by many regarded as his masterpiece, even greater than the 9th. After this he seems to have relaxed again in the 6th, 7th, and 8th, in order to prepare himself for the climax of his career in his final symphonic work, the 9th. In the slow movement of the 6th, the pastoral, in which he imitates the call of birds, he gives the direction, "Mehr Empfindung als Malerei," more feeling than painting, a direction which often is quoted by opponents of modern program music, notwithstanding the fact that Beethoven, in spite of his own qualifying words, straightway indulged in painting of the most childish description. The 7th Symphony is an extremely brilliant work, and the 8th an exceedingly joyous one, while with the 9th, as though he himself felt that he was going beyond the limits of orchestral music, he introduced in the last movement solo singers and a chorus, but not with as much effect as the employment of this unusual scheme might lead one to anticipate, because, unfortunately, his writing for voices is extremely awkward. Schubert's genius. Like Beethoven, Schubert wrote 9 symphonies, but the unfinished, which was his 8th, and the C major, his 9th, which was discovered by Schumann in the possession of Schubert's brother and sent to Mendelssohn for production at Leipzig, are the ones which seem destined to survive. They are among the most beautiful examples of orchestral music. The first movement of the unfinished symphony, full of dramatic moments as well as of exquisite melody, the slow movement a veritable rose of orchestration, while as regards the C major symphony, Schumann's reference to its quote, "heavenly length" unquote, sufficiently describes its inspiration. Mendelssohn's Italian and Scotch symphonies are his best-known orchestral works. They are clear and serene, and for anyone who thinks a symphony is something very abstruse and wants to be gradually familiarized with its mysteries, they form an easily taken and innocuous dose, the symphony made palatable. Of Schumann's 4 symphonies, the one in E-flat, the Rhenish, supposed to represent a series of impressions of the Rhine country, the 4th movement especially, to represent the exaltation which possessed his soul during a religious ceremony in the cathedral at Cologne, and the D minor, which latter really is a fantasia, deserve to rank highest. In the D minor the movements follow each other without pause. There is a certain thematic relationship between the first and the last movements, and this connection gives the work a freer and more modern effect. But Schumann was either indifferent to, or ignorant of, the advance in orchestration which had taken place since Beethoven. Practically the same thing applies to Brahms, who, however, deserves the credit for introducing into the symphony a new style of movement, the intermezzo, which takes the place of the scherzo or minuet. Rubinstein deserves honorable mention, but the most modern heroes of symphony are Dvorak with his New World and Tchaikovsky with his Pathétique. That may help keep a sinking art form afloat. But modern orchestral music is tending more and more toward the symphonic poem and the tone poem. Liszt has written 2 symphonies, the Faust Symphony, consisting of 3 movements, which represent the 3 principal characters of Goethe's drama, Faust, Gretchen, and Mephistopheles, and a symphony to Dante's Divina Commedia. In both these symphonies a chorus is introduced. Of his symphonic poems, the best known are Les Préludes and Tasso, Lamento et Trionfo. In these symphonic poems, Liszt has made use of the principle of the leitmotif in orchestral music. They are dramatic episodes for orchestra, superbly instrumentated, profoundly beautiful in thought and intention, great program music in fact, because conceived in accordance with the highest canons of the art, and infinitely more interesting than pure music, because they mean something. By some people Liszt is regarded as a mere charlatan, by others as a great composer. Not only was he a great composer, but one of the very greatest. The Saint-Saëns symphonic poems, Rouet d'Omphale, Phaéton, Danse macabre, should be mentioned as successful works of this class, but considerably below Liszt's in genuine musical value. And then there are the orchestral impressions of Charles Martin Le Fler, among which the symphonic poem La Mort de Tintagiles is the most conspicuous. A separate chapter is devoted to Richard Strauss. Wagner is not supposed to have been a purely orchestral composer. Theoretically, he wrote for the theatre, and his orchestra was, again theoretically, only part of a triple scheme of voice, action, and instrumental accompaniment. But put the instrumental part of any of his great music drama episodes on a concert program, and with the first wave of the conductor's baton and the first chord, you forget everything else that has gone before. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Thomas Koos Kosmarski. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 12. Richard Strauss and his music. Richard Strauss, a new name to conjure with in music. His banner is borne by a band of enthusiasts like those who, many years ago, carried the flag of Wagner to the front. Did not Wagner put a full stop after the word music? Some will ask in surprise. Did he not strike the final note? Are the Ring, Tristan, and Parsifal not to be succeeded by an eternal pause? Is there something still to be achieved in music, as in other arts and sciences? Something new certainly has been achieved by Richard Strauss. It forms neither a continuation of Wagner nor an opposition to Wagner. It has nothing to do with Wagner beyond that Strauss appropriates whatever in the progression of art the latest master has a right to take from his predecessors. Strauss is, in fact, one of the most original and individual of composers. He has been a student, not a copyist of Wagner. Thus, where others who have sat at the feet of the Bayreuth master have written poor imitations of Wagner, and have therefore failed even to continue the school, giving only feeble echoes of its great master, Strauss has struck out for himself. With a mastery of every technical resource acquired by deep and patient study, he has given wholly new value and importance to a form of art entirely different from the music drama. The music of the average modern Wagner disciple sounds not like Wagner, but like Wagner and water. Richard Strauss sounds like Richard Strauss. One reason for this is that his artwork, like Wagner's, has an independent intellectual reason for being. Let me not for one moment be understood as belittling Wagner in order to magnify Strauss. Wagner is the one creator of an art form who also seems destined to remain its greatest exponent. Other creators of art forms have been mere pioneers, leaving to those who have come after them the development and rounding out of what with them were experiments. The story of the sonata form may be said to have begun with Philipp Emanuel Bach, and to have been continued in our next to Beethoven, with supplements ever since. The music drama had its tentative beginnings in The Flying Dutchman, its consummation in Parsifal. The years from 1843 to 1882 lay between, but the music drama was guided ever by the same hand, the master hand of Richard Wagner. No, it would be self-defeating folly to make Wagner appear less in order to have Strauss appear more. Originator of the tone poem. Nor does Richard Strauss require such tactics. He has made 3 excursions into music drama, and he may make others. But his fame, at present, rests mainly upon what he has accomplished as an instrumental composer, and in the self-created realm of the tone poem. Tone poem is a new term in music. It stands for something that outstrips the symphonic poem of Liszt, something larger both in its boundaries and in its intellectual and musical scope. Strauss does not limit himself by the word symphonic. He leaves himself free to give full range to his ideas. A composer of program music, his works are so stupendous in scope that the word symphonic would have hampered him. His "Also sprach Zarathustra," thus spake Zarathustra, and "Ein Heldleben," a hero's life, are not symphonic poems, but tone poems of enormous proportions. These, his last 2 instrumental productions, together with the growing familiarity of the musical public with his beautiful and eloquent songs, established his reputation in this country. Today, a Strauss work on a program means as much to the musically elect as a Wagner work meant a quarter of a century ago. In fact, to advanced musicians, to those who are not content to rest upon what has been achieved, but are ready to welcome further serious effort, Strauss's works form the latest great utterance in music. Let me repeat verbatim a conversation that occurred on a recent rainy night, the date of an important concert. He: "Are you going to the concert tonight?" She, looking out and seeing that it still is raining hard: "Do they play anything by Richard Strauss?" He: "Not tonight." She: "Oh, then I'm not going." This woman could meet the most enthusiastic admirer of Beethoven or Wagner in his own ground, but when she heard Ein Heldenleben under Emil Parr's baton at a concert of the New York Philharmonic Society, she heard what she had been waiting 20 years for. Something new in music that also was something great, something that was not merely an imitation of what she had heard 100 times before, but something which pointed the way to untraveled paths. It always is a woman who throws the first rose at the feet of genius, not a juggler with the orchestra. One first looks at Richard Strauss in mere amazement at the size of what he has produced. Thus Spake Zarathustra lasts 33 minutes. A Hero's Life, 45, considerable lengths for orchestral works. This initial sense of bigness, as such, having worn off, one becomes aware of marvelous tone combinations and orchestral effects. Listening again, one discovers that these daring instrumental combinations have not been entered into merely for the sake of juggling with the orchestra, but because the composer, being a modern of moderns, has the most modern message in music to deliver, and in order to deliver it, has developed the modern orchestra to a state of efficiency and versatility of tonal expression beyond any of his predecessors. Richard Strauss scores, in the most causal manner, an octave higher than Beethoven dared go with the violins. Except in the Egmont Overture, Beethoven did not carry the violins higher than F above the staff. What should have been higher, he wrote an octave lower. All the strings in the Richard Strauss orchestra are scored correspondingly high, but this is not done as a mere fad. What Richard Strauss accomplishes with the strings is not merely queer or bizarre. What he seeks and obtains is genuine original musical effects. Often the highest register is used by him in a few of the strings only because, for certain polyphonic effects, the weaving and interweaving of various themes, he divides and subdivides all the strings into numerous groups. For the same reason, he has regularly added 4 to 5 hitherto rarely used instruments to the woodwind, and scores regularly for 8 horns, besides employing from 4 to 5 trumpets. While he has increased the technical difficulties of every instrument, what he requires of them is not possible. He does, indeed, call for first-rate artists in his orchestra, but so did Wagner, as compared with Beethoven. He knows every instrument thoroughly, for he has taken lessons on all, and therefore, when he is striving for new instrumental effects, he is not putting problems which cannot be legitimately solved. His Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks makes, possibly, the greatest demand of all his work on an orchestra. But, if properly played, it is one of the most bizarre and amusing scherzos in the repertoire. In his Don Quixote, he has gone outside the list of orchestral instruments, and in the scene where Don Quixote has his tilt with the windmill, he has introduced a regular theatrical wind machine. And why not? The effect to be produced justifies the means. There is an a cappella chorus by Strauss for 16 voices. These are not divided into double quartets, or into 4 quartets, but the composition actually is scored in 16 parts. He shrinks from no musical problem, not mere bulk and noise. When A Hero's Life was produced in New York, it was given at a public rehearsal and concert of the Philharmonic. It made such a profound impression, it was recognized as music, not as mere bulk and noise, that it had to be repeated at a following public rehearsal and concert, thus having the honor of 4 consecutive performances by the same society in one season. Previous performances of Strauss's works, mainly by the Chicago Orchestra under Thomas and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, had begun to direct public attention to this composer. But the Heldenleben performances by the Philharmonic created something of a sensation. They made the hit to which the public unconsciously had been working up for several seasons. Large as are the dimensions of A Hero's Life, Richard Strauss had chosen a subject that made a very direct appeal. Despite its wealth of polyphony and theme combination, the score told, without a word of synopsis, a clear, intelligible story of a hero's material victory, followed by a greater moral one. It placed the public on a human, familiar footing with a composer whom previously they had regarded with more awe than interest. Here was music interesting as mere music, but all the more interesting because it had an intellectual message to convey. Life and truth. What is the difference between classical music and modern music? Write a chapter or a book on it, and the difference still remains just this. Classical music is the expression of beauty. Modern music, the expression of life and truth. Modern music seems entering upon a new era with Strauss, which does not necessarily exclude beauty. It is beginning to illustrate itself, so to speak, like the author-artist who can both write and draw. Today, music not only expresses truth, but represents it pictorially. How long will the time be in coming when a composer will wave his baton, the orchestra strike a chord, and we be not only listening, but also beholders, hearing the chord and seeing at the same time its image floating above the orchestra? In his Melomaniacs, the most remarkable collection of musical stories I have read, Mr. Huneker has a tale called A Piper of Dreams, the most advanced piece of musical fiction I know of. This Piper of Dreams produces music which is seen. "Do you know why you like it?" Mr. Huneker asked me when I told him how intensely I admired the story. "Because," he continued, "the hero of the story is a Richard Strauss." Of course, this brilliantly written story was a daring incursion into a seemingly impossible future. Yet it points a tendency. When shall we have music that can be seen? Considering how closely related are the laws of acoustics and optics, is a Piper of Dreams so visionary? Who knows but that the music of the future may be visible sound, the work of a Piper of Dreams? Sometimes, when listening to Strauss, I think Mr. Huneker's Piper is tuning up. Richard Strauss's tone poems are large in plan. In fact, they are colossal. They show him to be a man of great intellectual activity, as well as an inspired composer. The latter, of course, is the test by which a musical work stands or falls. No matter how intellectually it is planned. If it is inadequate, musically it fails. But if it is musically inspired, it gains vastly in effect when it rests on a brain basis. Literally, tone dramas. That Richard Strauss is the most significant figure in the musical world today seems to me too patent to admit of discussion. The only question to be considered is, how has he become so? The question is best answered by showing what a Richard Strauss tone poem is. Take Thus Spake Zarathustra and A Hero's Life. Without going into an elaborate discussion, I must insist that to consider Richard Strauss as in any way a development from Berlioz or Liszt shows a deplorable unfamiliarity with his works. Berlioz wrote program music. Liszt wrote program music. Richard Strauss writes program music, but this point of resemblance is wholly superficial. Berlioz admittedly strove to adhere to the orthodox symphonic form. Liszt aptly named his own productions symphonic poems. They are much freer in form than Berlioz's, and possibly pointed the way to the Richard Strauss tone poem. But when we examine the musical kernel, the differences at once is apparent. Polyphony, that is, the simultaneous interweaving of many themes, was foreign to Berlioz and Liszt. Their style is mainly homophonic. Richard Strauss is a polyphonic composer, second not even to Wagner, whose system of leading motives in his music dramas made his scores such marvelous polyphonic structures. Such, too, are the scores of Richard Strauss's tone poems. None but a master of polyphony could have attempted to express in music what Richard Strauss has expressed. For are not his tone poems literally tone dramas? It was like a man of great intellectual activity, such as Richard Strauss is, to select for musical illustration the Faust of modern literature. Nietzsche's Zarathustra. The composer became interested in Nietzsche's works in 1892, when he was writing his music drama Guntram. The full fruition of his study of this philosopher's works is Thus Spake Zarathustra. But this is not an attempt to set Nietzsche to music, not an effort to express a system of philosophy through sound. It is rather the musical portrayal of a quest, a being longing to solve the problems of life, finding at the end of his varied pilgrimage that which he had left at the beginning, nature deep and inscrutable. Musically, the great fortissimo outburst in C major, which, at the beginning of the work, greets the seeker on the mountain-top with the glories of the sunrise, is the symbol of nature. The seeker descends the mountain. He pursues the quest and many surroundings among all sorts and conditions of men. He experiences joy, passion, remorse. In wisdom, perchance, lies the final solution of the problem of life. But the emptiness of wisdom is depicted by the composer with the keenest satire in a learned yet dry 5-part fugue. The seeker's varied experiences form as many divisions of the tone poem. There is even a waltz theme, unending joy. Therein he may reach the end of his quest. But hark! A sombre strophe, followed 12 times by the even fainter stroke of a bell. Then a theme winging its flight on the highest register of modern instrumentation, until it seems to rise over the orchestra and vanish into thin air. It is the soul of the seeker, his earthly quest ended, while the theme, which greeted him at sunrise on the mountain-top, resounds in the orchestral depths, the symbol of nature, still mysterious, still inscrutable. An intellectual force in music. Even this brief synopsis suggests that Zarathustra is planned on a large scale. It presupposes an intellectual grasp of the subject on the composer's part. In its choice, in the selection and rejection of details, and in outlining his scheme, Richard Strauss shows that he has thoroughly assimilated Nietzsche. But at a certain point, the musician in Richard Strauss asserts himself above the litterateur. Thus Spake Zarathustra was not intended for a preachment, save indirectly. From what occurs during that vain quest, from the last deep mysterious chord of the nature theme, let the listener draw his own conclusion. In the last analysis, Thus Spake Zarathustra is not a philosophical treatise, but a tone poem. In the last analysis, Richard Strauss is not a philosopher, but a musician. A Hero's Life is another work of large plan. Like Zarathustra, it derives its importance as an artwork from its eloquence as a musical composition. With a musical work, no matter how intellectual or dramatic its foundation, its test ever will be its value as pure music. Richard Wagner's theories would have fallen like a house of cards had not his music been eloquent and beautiful. But as his music gained wonderfully in added eloquence and beauty by induction from its intellectual content, so does Strauss's. The fact is, music is music, while philosophies come and go. Yesterday it was Schopenhauer. Today it is Nietzsche. Tomorrow it will be another. Doubtless Wagner thought his Ring was Schopenhauer's negation of the will to live, set to music. Possibly Richard Strauss thought Nietzsche looked out between the bars of Thus Spake Zarathustra. In point of fact, neither Wagner nor Richard Strauss incorporated their favorite philosophers in their music. Wagner may have derived his inspiration from his reading of Schopenhauer, and Richard Strauss from Nietzsche, for one mind inspires another. But the real result, both in Wagner and Strauss, was great music. This is made clear by Strauss's A Hero's Life. Like Zarathustra, it would be effective as music without a line of programmatic explanation. The latter simply adds to its effectiveness by giving it the further interest of fiction and ethical import. In A Hero's Life we hear and see, if you like, the hero himself, his jealous adversaries, the woman whose love consoles him, the battle in which he wins his greatest worldly triumph, his mission of peace, the world's indifference, and the final flight of his soul toward the Empyrean. All this is depicted musically with the greatest eloquence. The battlefield scene is a stupendous massing of orchestral forces. On the other hand, the amorous episode entitled The Hero's Helpmate is impassioned and charming. In the world's indifference to the hero's mission of peace, there is little doubt that Strauss was indulging in a retrospect of his own struggles for recognition. For here are heard numerous reminiscences of his earlier works, his tone poems, Don Juan, Death and Transfiguration, Macbeth, Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, Thus Spake Zarathustra, Don Quixote, his music drama, Guntram, and his song, Dream During Twilight. These reminiscences give A Hero's Life the same autobiographical interest as attaches Wagner's Meistersinger. Tribute to Wagner. Strauss pays a tribute to Wagner in the one-act opera Führer's Not, Fire Famine. According to the old legend on which this Sing-Gedicht song poem is founded, a young maiden has offended her lover, but the lover, being a magician, casts a spell over the town, causing the extinction of all fire, bringing cold and darkness upon the entire place, until the maiden relents and smiles again upon him, when the spell is lifted and the fires once more burn brightly. The young lover, Kunrad, is rebuking the people of the city, says, "In this house which today I destroy, once lodged Richard the Master. Disgracefully did ye expel him, in envy and baseness," etc., etc. Accompanying these lines, Richard Strauss introduces themes from Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. Undoubtedly, Richard the Master, in the above lines, is Richard Wagner. While Mr. Power was not the first orchestral leader who has played Strauss's music in this country, he may justly be regarded as Strauss's prophet in New York at least. Not only do we owe to him the performances of A Hero's Life, which definitely created Strauss here, but it was he who brought forward Thus Spake Zarathustra, when he was conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. As long ago as 1889, when Mr. Power was conductor at Mannheim, he invited Strauss to direct his symphony in F minor there. Strauss accepted and also brought with him his just completed Macbeth, asking to be allowed to try it over with the orchestra, as he wanted to hear it, a request which was readily granted. Afterward, at Mr. Power's house, Strauss's piano quartet was played, with the composer himself at the piano and Mr. Power at the violin. It was not surprising that when Mr. Power came over here as the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, he championed Richard Strauss's work, continued to do so after he became conductor of the New York Philharmonic Society, and probably still does as a conductor of the Pittsburgh Orchestra. Strauss has become such an important figure in the world of music that it is interesting to note what has been done to bring his work before the American public. Theodore Thomas, with the artistic liberality which he has always displayed toward every serious effort in music, produced Strauss's Symphony in F minor, which bears date 1883, as early as December 13th, 1884, with the New York Philharmonic Society. It was the first performance of this work anywhere. Strauss was not, however, heard again at the concerts of this organization until January 1892, when Seidel brought out Death and Transfiguration. After he became conductor of the Chicago Orchestra, Thomas gave many performances of Richard Strauss's works. In 1895, the Prelude to Guntram, Death and Transfiguration, and Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks in 1897. Don Juan and Thus Spake Zarathustra in 1899, Don Quixote and the Symphonic Fantasia, Italy in 1900, A Hero's Life, the first performance in this country, and the Serenade for Wind Instruments. In 1902, Macbeth, first performance in this country, and the Fears Not Fragment. Several of these works, besides those noted, had their first performance in this country by the Chicago Orchestra, and several have had repeated performances. The Boston Symphony Orchestra also has a fine record as regards the performance of Richard Strauss's works. Nikish, Parr, and Garrick are the conductors under whom these performances have been given. Several of the works have been played repeatedly, not only in Boston, but in other cities where this famous orchestra gives concerts. Richard Straussiana. As data regarding Strauss's life at the disposal of English readers are both scant and scattered, it may be amiss to tell here something of his career. He was born on June 11, 1864, in Munich, where his father, Franz Strauss, played the French horn in the Royal Orchestra, and was noted for his remarkable proficiency on the instrument. The elder Strauss lived long enough to watch with pride his son's growing fame. Richard began to play the piano when he was 4 years old. At the age of 6, he heard some children singing around a Christmas tree. "I can compose something like that," he said, and he produced, unaided, a 3-part song. When he went to school, his mother, by chance, put covers of music papers on his books. As a result, he occupied much of his time composing on this paper, and during a French lesson sketched out the scherzo of a string quartet, which has been published as his Opus 2. While he was still at school, he composed a symphony in D minor. This was played by the Royal Orchestra under Levy. When, in response to calls for the composer, Richard came out, someone in the audience asked, "What has that boy to do with the symphony?" "Oh, he's only the composer," was the reply. The year before, 1880, the Royal Opera prima donna Meisenheim had publicly sung 3 of his songs. During his advanced school years, his piano lessons continued. He received lessons in the violin, and went through a severe course in composition with the Royal Kapellmeister Meyer. In 1882, he attended the University of Munich. His Serenade for Wind Instruments, composed at this time, attracted the attention of Hans von Bülow, under whom he studied for a while at Raff's Conservatory in Frankfurt. Bülow invited him to Meiningen as co-director of the orchestra, and when in November 1885 Bülow resigned as conductor, Strauss became his successor, remaining there, however, only till April 1886. His Symphonic Fantasia, Italy, had its origin through a trip to Rome and Naples during this year. In August 1886, he was appointed assistant conductor to Levy and Fischer at the Munich Opera, where he remained until July 1889, when he became conductor at Weimar. In 1892, he almost died from an attack of pneumonia, and on his recovery took a long trip through Greece, Egypt, and Sicily. It was on this tour that he wrote and composed Guntram, which was brought out at Weimar in May 1894. After the performance, he announced his engagement to the singer of Freihild in Guntram, Pauline de Anna, the daughter of a Bavarian general. The same year he returned to Munich as conductor, remaining there until 1899, when he became one of the conductors at the Berlin Opera, which position he still holds. He is one of the star conductors of Europe, receiving invitations to conduct concerts in many cities, including Brussels, Moscow, Amsterdam, Barcelona, Madrid, London, and Paris. And his American tour was a memorable one. He is a man of untiring industry. It is said that he worked no less than half a year on Thus Spake Zarathustra, and that the writing of his scores is a model of beauty. Strauss occupies a commanding position in the world of music. He has achieved it through a remarkable combination of musical technique and inspiration coupled with rare industry. His ideals are of the highest. His intellectual activity is great. He seems a man of calm and noble poise, of broad horizon. It would be presumption to speak of expectations as to one who has accomplished so much. For the great achievements already to his credit, and among these Salome surely must be included, are the best promise for the future. End of chapter 12. Recording by John Thomas Koos, John Thomas Koos Kosmarski, www.validateyourlife.com.
Chapter 13 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Summerfield. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe, Chapter 13. A Note on Chamber Music. Lovers of chamber music form an extremely refined and cultured class, and like all highly refined and cultured people, are very conservative. They are the purists among music lovers, the last people who would care to see the classical forms abandoned, and who would be disturbed, not to say shocked, by any great departure from the sonata form. For the string quartet is to chamber music what the symphony is to orchestra, and the sonata to the pianoforte, is in fact a sonata for 2 violins, viola and violoncello, just as the symphony is a sonata for orchestra. Oddly enough, a pianoforte solo is more effective in a large hall than a string quartet, although the latter employs 4 times as many instruments, and the same is true of those pieces of chamber music in which the pianoforte is used, such as sonatas for pianoforte and violin or violoncello, pianoforte trios, quartets, quintets, and so on. A fine soloist on the pianoforte will be more at home in a large auditorium like Carnegie Hall or even the Metropolitan Opera House than would a string quartet or any other combination of chamber music players. Paderewski plays in Carnegie Hall, and I am sure would be equally effective in the Opera House, but an organization of chamber music players would be lost in either place. The Kneisel Quartet plays in New York in Mendelssohn Hall, a small auditorium which is just about correctly proportioned for music of this kind. Indeed, compared with the opera, the orchestra, and even with the pianoforte, chamber music requires a setting like a jewel. For just as its devotees are the purists among music lovers, so chamber music itself is something very precious. It certainly is a most charming and intimate form of musical entertainment, and the constituency of a well-established string quartet inevitably consists of the musical elite. The same opinions that have been expressed regarding the sonatas and the symphonies of the great composers apply in a general way to their chamber music. Haydn's is naive, Mozart's more emotional in expression, Beethoven's, among that of classical composers, the most dramatic. In fact, Beethoven's last quartets, in which the instruments are employed quite independently and in which roles practically of equal importance are assigned to each, are regarded by Richard Strauss as having given the cue to Wagner for his polyphonic treatment of the orchestra, and Wagner himself spoke of them as works through which music first raised herself to an equal height with the poetry and painting of the greatest periods of the past. Nevertheless, there are many who hold that in his last quartets Beethoven sought to accomplish more than can be expressed with four-stringed instruments, and prefer his earlier works of this class, like the three Razumovsky quartets, opus 59, dedicated by the composer to Count Razumovsky, who maintained a private string quartet in which he played second violin, the others being professionals. Schubert's most famous quartet is the one in D minor, with the lovely slow movement, a theme with variations, the theme being his own song, Death and the Maiden. One of the greatest works in the whole range of chamber music is his string quintet, with two violoncellos. His pianoforte trios also are noble contributions to this branch of musical art. One glance at this trio, writes Schumann of the Schubert trio in B-flat major, and all the wretchedness of existence is put to flight, and the world seems young again. Many and beautiful as are the things time brings forth, it will be long ere it produces another Schubert. Mendelssohn's chamber music is as polished, affable, and gentlemanly as most of his other productions, and rapidly falling into the same state of unlamented desuetude. Schumann has given us his lovely pianoforte quintet in E-flat. Brahms has contributed much that is noteworthy to chamber music, and, as a rule, it is less complex and more intelligently scored than his orchestral music. Dvorak, in his E-flat major quartet, opus 51, introduces as the second movement a Dumka, or Bohemian elegy, one of the most exquisite of his compositions. Fascinating in his national musical tints, he was genius enough for his music to be universal in its expression, and he who used the folk songs of his native Bohemia so skillfully was no less artistic in the results he accomplished when, during his residence in New York, he wrote his string quartet in F. Opus 96 on Negro themes. Tchaikovsky and Neo-Russians like Arensky and the Frenchmen César Franck, Saint-Saëns, Dandy and Debussy are some of the modern names that figure on chamber music programs. End of chapter 13. Recording by Dick Summerfield, Eindhoven, the Netherlands.
Chapter 14 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reese. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 14. Songs and Song Composers. Songs either are strophic or durchkomponiert, composed through. In the strophic song, the melody and accompaniment are repeated unchanged through each stanza or strophe of the poem, while when a song is composed through, the music, although the principal melody may be repeated more than once, is subjected to changes in accordance with the moods of the poem. Schubert is the first song composer who requires serious consideration. While not strictly the originator of the Lied, he is universally acknowledged to be the first great song composer, and to have lifted song to its proper place of importance in music. Gluck set Klopstock's odes to music. Haydn, as a songwriter, is remembered by Liebes Mädchen hör mir zu, Mozart by Das Veilchen, and Beethoven by Adelaide, and one or two other songs. Before Schubert's day, this form of composition was regarded as something rather trivial and beneath the dignity of genius. But Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven at least did one thing through which they may possibly have contributed to the development of songwriting. By their freer writing for the pianoforte, they prepared the way for the Schubert accompaniments. Where Schubert got his musical genius from is a mystery. His father was a schoolmaster, whose first wife, Schubert's mother, was a cook. The couple had 14 children, and an income of $175. If this income is somewhat disproportionate to the size of the family, it yet is fortunate that they had 14 children, instead of only 13. Otherwise there would have been one great name less in musical history, for Schubert was the 14th. He was born in Vienna in January, 1797. His 31 years, for this genius who so enriched music lived to be only 31, were passed in poverty. His father was wretchedly poor, and his own works, when they could be disposed of at all to publishers, were sold at beggarly prices. Now they are universally recognized as masterpieces, and are worth many times their weight in gold. Too poor to buy music paper. Shortly before he was 12 years old, Schubert, who had been singing soprano solos and playing violin in the parish choir, was sent to the so-called convict, the imperial school for training boys for the court chapel. During his 5 years there his progress was so rapid that even before he was 14 years old he was occasionally asked to substitute for the conductor of the school orchestra. Life, however, was hard. He had no money with which to buy even a few luxuries in the way of food to eke out the wretched fare of the convict, nor music paper. Had it not been for the kindness of a fellow pupil and friend named Spaun, he would not have been able to write down and work out his ideas. When his voice changed, the straitened family circumstances obliged him to become an assistant in his father's school. He was able to bear poverty with patience, but not the drudgery of teaching, and he is said often to have lost his temper with the boys. Altogether he taught for 3 years, 1815 to 1818, and while his work was most distasteful to him, his genius was so spontaneous that during his 3 years he composed many songs, among them his immortal Erlking. Finally, a university student, Franz von Schober, who, having heard some of Schubert's songs, had become an enthusiastic admirer of the composer, offered him one of his rooms as a lodging, whereupon Schubert, straightway accepting the offer, gave up teaching, and from that time to the end of his brief life led a bohemian existence, with a clique of friends of varied accomplishments. In this circle he was known as Canevas, because whenever some new person joined it, his first question regarding the newcomer was, "Kann was?" Can he do anything? Outside a small circle of acquaintances, Schubert remained practically unknown, until he made the acquaintance of Johann Michael Vogl, an opera singer, to whom his devoted friend von Schober introduced him. Vogl was somewhat reserved in his opinion of the songs which he tried over with Schubert at their first meeting, but they made an impression. He followed up the acquaintance, and became the first professional interpreter of Schubert's lyrics. "The manner in which Vogl sings and I accompany," wrote Schubert to his brother Ferdinand, "so that we appear like one on such occasions, is something new and unheard of to our listeners." Publishers, however, held aloof. 5 years after the Erlking was composed, several of them refused to print it, although Schubert offered to forego royalties on it. Finally, some of Schubert's friends had the song published at their own expense, and its success led to the issuing of 11 other songs, Schubert unwisely accepting 800 florins in lieu of royalty on these and the Erlking. Yet from one of these songs alone, The Wanderer, the publishers received 27,000 florins between the years 1822 and 1861. How the Erlking was composed. Schubert being the greatest of song composers, and the Erlking his greatest song, the circumstances under which it was written are of especial interest. His friend Spaun, the same who provided him with music paper at the convict, relates that one afternoon toward the close of the year 1815, he went with the poet Meyerhofer to visit Schubert. They found the composer all aglow, reading the Erlking aloud to himself. He walked up and down the room several times, book in hand, then suddenly sat down, and as fast as his pen could travel, put the music on paper. Having no piano, the 3 men hurried over to the convict, where the Erlking was sung the same evening, and received with enthusiasm. The old court organist, Ruzicka, afterward played it over himself without the voice, and when some of those present objected to the dissonance which occurs 3 times in the course of the composition, and depicts the child's terror of the Erlking, the old organist struck these chords and explained how perfectly they reflected the spirit of the poem, and how felicitously they were worked out in the musical resolution. Schubert's song is almost Wagnerian in its descriptive and dramatic quality. The coaxing voice of the Erlking, the terror of the child, the efforts of the father to allay his boy's fears, each has its characteristic expression, which yet is different from the narrative portions of the poem, while in the accompaniment the horse gallops along. Schubert was but 18 years old when he set this ballad of Goethe's to music, yet there is no more thrilling climax to be found in all song literature than those dissonances which I have mentioned, and which, with each repeat, rise to a higher interval and become each time more shrill with terror. Whoever has heard Lily Lehmann sing this song should be able to appreciate its real greatness, as Goethe, who had remained utterly indifferent to Schubert's music, did when the Erlking was sung to him by Frau Schroeder-Devrient, to whom he exclaimed, "Thank you 1,000 times for this great artistic achievement. When I heard this song before I did not like it at all, but sung in your way it becomes a true picture." Finck on Schubert. More than 600 songs by Schubert have been published, and when we remember that he wrote symphonies, sonatas, shorter pianoforte pieces, chamber music, and operas, the fertility of his brief life is astounding. The rapidity with which he composed, however, was not due to carelessness, but to the spontaneity of his genius, and the fact that he loved to compose. He composed as a bird sings in the spring, or as a well gushes from a mountainside, simply because he could not help it, says Mr. Finck in his Songs and Songwriters. We have it on the authority of Schubert's friend Spaun that when he went to bed he kept his spectacles on, so that when he woke up he could go right to the table and compose without wasting time looking for his glasses. In the 2 years, 1815 through 16, he wrote no less than 254 songs. 6 of the songs in the Winterreise cycle were composed in one morning, and he had 8 songs to his credit in a single day. The charming Hark, Hark the Lark was written at a tavern where he chanced to see the poem in a book the leaves of which he was slowly turning over. "If I only had some music paper!" he exclaimed, whereupon one of his friends promptly ruled lines on the back of his Speisekarte, and Schubert, with the varied noises of the tavern going on about him, jotted down the song then and there. Of course, it is impossible to touch on all the aspects of such a genius as his. In his songs clear and beautiful melody is, as a rule, combined with a descriptive accompaniment. Sometimes the description is given by means of only a few chords, like the preluding ones in Am Meer. At other times the description runs through the entire accompaniment, like the waves that flash and dance around the melody of Auf dem Wasser zu singen, the galloping horse in the Erlking, the veiled mist that seems to hang over the scenes in the wonderfully dramatic poem Die Stadt, the flutter of the bird in Hark, Hark the Lark, the brook that flows like a leitmotif through the Maid of the Mill cycle. These are a few of the examples that with Schubert could be cited by the dozen. And the range of his work. Here again space forbids the multiplication of examples. It extends from the naive Haydn Röslein to the tragic Doppelgänger, from the whispering foliage of the linden tree to the pathetic drone of the hurdy-gurdy man, from the serenade to Tod und das Mädchen. Schubert is the greatest genius among song composers. Compare the growing reputation of him who of all musicians was perhaps the most neglected during his life, with that of Mendelssohn, the most feted of composers, but now rapidly dropping to the position of a minor tone poet, and who, although he wrote 83 songs, is as a songwriter remembered outside of Germany by barely more than one Lied, the familiar On the Wings of Song. Schumann's individuality. In Schumann's songs the piano part is more closely knit and interwoven with the vocal melody than with Schubert's, and as a result the voice does not stand out so clearly. While his songs are not what they have been called by a German critic, pianoforte pieces with accidental vocal accompaniments, at times in his vocal compositions the pianoforte gains too great an ascendancy over the voice. If asked to draw a distinction between Schubert and Schumann, I should say that there is a twofold interest in most of Schubert's songs. He reproduces the feeling of the poem in his vocal melody. Then, if the poem contains a descriptive suggestion, he produces that phrase of it in his accompaniment, without, however, allowing the pianoforte part to encroach on the vocal melody. The melody gives the feeling, the accompaniment the description or mood picture. Schumann, on the other hand, rarely is descriptive. Nearly always he produces a mood picture in tone, but requires both voice and pianoforte to effect his purpose. As this, however, is Schumann's method of composition, and as it is better that each composer should leave the seal of his individuality on everything he does, and not be an imitator, it is not cause for regret that while Schubert is Schubert, Schumann is Schumann. The proportion of fine songs among the 245 composed by Schumann is, however, much smaller than in the heritage left us by Schubert, and while Schubert, from the time he wrote his first great vocal compositions, added many equally great ones every year, Schumann's songs, on the whole, show a decided falling off after he had wooed and won Clara Wieck. It was during his courtship that he produced his best songs. Separated from her by the command of her stern father, he made love to her in music. "I am now writing nothing but songs, great and small," we find him saying in a letter to a friend, in the summer of 1840. "Hardly can I tell you how delicious it is to write for voice instead of for instruments, and what a turmoil and tumult I feel within me when I sit down to do it." While he was composing his song cycle, Die Myrten, he wrote to Clara, "Since yesterday morning I have written 27 pages of music, all new, concerning which the best I can tell you is that I laughed and wept for joy while composing them." A month later he writes her, in sending her his first printed songs, "When I composed them my soul was within yours. Without such a love, indeed, no one could write such music, and this I intend as a special compliment. I could sing myself to death like a nightingale," he writes to her again on May 15th. "Never was there such a musical wooing as those who wish to participate in it can do so by singing or listening to such songs as Dedication, The Almond Tree, The Lotus Flower, In the Forest, Waldegespräch, Spring Night, He, the Noblest of the Noble, Thou Ring upon My Finger, 'Twas in the lovely month of May, Where'er my tears are falling, I'll not complain, and Nightly in my dreaming." Among his songs not inspired by love should be mentioned the Two Grenadiers, which Plancon sings so inimitably. Phases of Franz's Genius. Robert Franz (1815 1892) had his life embittered by neglect and physical ills. His family name originally was Knauth, his father having been Christoph Knauth. But in order to distinguish him from his brother, who was engaged in the same business, he was addressed as Christoph Franz, a name which he subsequently had legalized. Yet critics insisted that Robert Franz was a pseudonym which the composer had adopted from vanity, in order to indicate that he was as great as Robert Schumann and Franz Schubert put together. Franz was strongly influenced by Bach and Handel, many of whose scores he supplied with what are known as additional accompaniments, filling out gaps which these composers left in their score, according to the custom of their day. His songs show this influence in their polyphony, and the German critic Ambros said that Franz's song Der schwere Abend looked as if Bach had sat down and composed a Franz song out of thanks for all that Franz was to do for him through his additional accompaniments. Besides their polyphony derived from Bach, Franz's songs are interesting for their modulations, which are employed not simply for the sake of showing cleverness or originality, but for their appropriateness in expressing the mood of the poem. He also was extremely careful in regard to the choice of key, and decidedly objected to transpositions of his songs, in order to make them singable for higher or lower voices than could use the original key. "When I am dead," he wrote to his publisher, "I cannot prevent these transpositions, but so long as I am alive I shall fight them." Franz did not endeavor to reproduce visible things in his pianoforte parts, and the voice in his songs often is declamatory, merging into melody only in the more deeply emotional passages. He is a reflective rather than a dramatic composer, disliked opera, and himself said that anyone who had penetrated deeply into his songs well knew that the dramatic element was not to be found in them, nor was it intended to be. Composers, however, have many theories regarding their music, which in practice come to naught, and whether Franz thought his songs dramatic or not, the fact remains that when Lilli Lehmann sang his Im Herbst, it was as thrillingly dramatic as anything could be. Self-critical. Franz was extremely self-critical. He kept his productions in his desk for years, working over them again and again, until in many cases the song in its final shape bore slight resemblance to what it had been at first. He declared his Opus 1 to be no worse than his latest work, because it had been composed with equal care and had had the benefit of his ripening judgment and experience. He admired Wagner, and dedicated one of his song volumes to him, but when some critics fancied that they discovered Wagnerian traits in several songs in his last collection, Opus 51 to 52, he was able to prove that these very songs were among the first he had written, and were published so late in his career simply because he had kept them back for revision. His physical disabilities were pitiable. When he was about 33 years old, and shortly after his marriage, he was standing in the Halle railroad station, when a locomotive close by sounded its shrill whistle. The effect upon him was like the piercing of his ears. For several days afterward he heard nothing but confused buzzing, and from that time on his hearing became worse and worse, until finally his ears pained him even when he composed. In 1876 he became totally deaf, and a few years later his right arm was paralyzed from shoulder to thumb. He was a poor man, and right at the worst time in his life, when he was totally deaf, a small pension which he had received from the Bach Society was taken away from him. But his admirers, many of them Americans, came to his rescue and raised a fund for his support. Among his finest songs are Widmung, Leise Zeit durch mein Gemüt, Bitte, Die Lotusblume, Es ragt der alte Eborus, Mir fällt, Das ist ein Brausen an Hühlen, Ich hab in deinem Auge, Ich will meine Seele taugen, and Es hat die Rose sich beglatt. Brahms as a thinker in music. Brahms was a profound thinker in music, not a philosopher but a reflective poet, whose musicianship, however, was so great that he cared too little for the practical side of his art as compared with the theoretical. If he wrote what looked all right on paper, he was indifferent as to whether it sounded right or not. Consequently, if he started out with a certain rhythmical figuration or a certain scheme of harmonic progression, he carried it through rigidly to its logical conclusion, utterly oblivious to, or at least utterly regardless of, any tonal blemishes that might result, although by slightly altering his scheme here and there he might have obviated these. This is the reason why some people find passages in his music which to them sound repellent. But those who have not allowed this aspect of Brahms's work to prejudice them, and have familiarized themselves with his music, well know that he is one of the loftiest souls that ever put pen to staff. He never is drastic, never sensational, never superficial, and the climaxes of his songs, as in his other music, are produced not by great outbursts of sound, but by sudden modulations or change of rhythm, which give a wonderful lift to voice and accompaniment. Among his best-known songs, and each of these is a masterpiece, are Wie bist du meine Königin, Ruhe, süß Liebchen, Von ewiger Liebe, Wiegenlied, Minnelied, Feldeinsamkeit, Wie Melodien seid es mir, Immer leiser wird mein Schlummer, Meine Lieder, Wir wandelten, wir zwei zusammen. One of the most impassioned modern lyrical outbursts is Jensen's setting of Heine's Lehn deine Wang an meine Wang, and his Frühlingsnacht also is a very beautiful song, although the popularity of Schumann's setting of the same poem has cast it unduly into the shade. Rubinstein will be found considerably less prolix in his songs than in his music in other branches, and those which he wrote to the Persian poems of von Bodenstedt, Mirza Schaffy, are fascinating in their oriental coloring. The Asra and Yellow Rolls at My Feet, Gold rollt mir zu Füßen, are among the best known of these, while Es blinkt der Tau, Du bist wie eine Blume, and Der Träum are among Rubinstein's songs, which are or should be in the repertoire of every singer. Tchaikovsky and Dvorak are not noteworthy as songwriters, but the former's setting of Nur wer die Sehnsucht kennt, and the latter's gypsy songs, are highly successful. Grieg's originality. One of the most fascinating among modern songwriters is the Norwegian, Grieg. He has been unusually fortunate in having a fine singer as a wife. Mr. Fink relates that Ibsen, after hearing her sing his poems as set to music by Grieg, whispered as she shook the hands of this musical couple one word: understood. Grieg's originality has not been thoroughly appreciated, because much of the beauty of his music has been attributed to what is supposed to be its Norwegian origin. Grieg is national, it is true, but not in a cramped or narrow sense. His music is the product of his individual genius, and his genius has made him so popular that what is his has come to be wrongly considered Norwegian, whereas it is Norway interpreted through the genius of Grieg. His music is not a dialect, but music of universal significance, fortunately tinged with his individuality. I Love You, Ibsen's The Swan, By the Riverside, Springtide, Wounded Heart, The Mother Sings, a mother mourning her dead child, At the Bier of a Young Woman, and From Monte Pincio are among his finest lieder. Chopin is much too little known as a songwriter. His genius as a composer for the pianoforte has overshadowed his songs, and the public is familiar with little else save The Maiden's Wish, which is one of Madame Sembrich's favorite encores, and to which she plays her own accompaniment so delightfully. But there is plenty of national color in the Lithuanina song, plenty of pathos in Poland's dirge, and plenty of lyrical passion in My Delights. Fink says that in all music, lyric or dramatic, the thrill of a kiss has never been expressed so ecstatically as in the 12 bars of this song marked crescendo sempre più accelerando. Certainly sempre, always, and accelerando, faster, are capital words when applied to a kiss. Richard Wagner, when 26 years old in Paris, tried to relieve his poverty by composing a few songs, among which is a very charming setting of Ronsard's Dors mon enfant. He also set Heine's The Two Grenadiers to music, utilizing the Marseillaise in the accompaniment, but as a whole the Wagner version of this poem is not as effective as Schumann's. In 1862 he composed music to 5 poems written by Mathilde Wesendonck, among which is the famous Träume, which utilizes the theme of the love duet that later appeared in Tristan. Liszt's genius for song. Liszt's songs are a complete musical exposition of the poems to which they are composed. Thus, while, by way of comparison, Rubinstein's setting of Du bist wie eine Blume gives through its simplicity a rare impression of purity, Liszt, in his setting of the same poem, adds to that purity the sense of sacredness with which the contemplation of a pure woman fills a man's heart and causes him to worship her. His Lorelei is a beautiful lyric scene. We view the flowing river, seem to hear the seductive voice of the temptress, and watch the treacherous and stormy current that hurries the ensnared boatman to his doom. And what song has more of that valuable quality we call atmosphere than Liszt's version of Kennst du das Land? As will be the case with Liszt in other branches of music, he will be recognized some day as one of the greatest of song composers. Richard Strauss's songs, from having been regarded as so bristling with difficulties as to be impossible, have become favorites in the song repertoire. When it is a genius who creates difficulties, these are sure to be overcome by ambitious players and singers, and music advances technically by just so much. Strauss's Ständchen, with its deliciously delicate accompaniment, so difficult to play with the requisite grace, was the first of Strauss's songs to become popular here, and it was the art of our great singer, Madame Nordica, that made it so. Now we hear Die Nacht, Traum durch die Dämmerung, Heimliche Aufforderung, Allerseelen, Breit über mein Haupt dein schwarzes Haar, and many of his other songs, with growing frequency. There are few song composers with whom the pianoforte accompaniment is so entirely distinct from the melody, or so difficult to play, as often is the case with Strauss. As with Schubert, every descriptive suggestion contained in the poem is carried into the accompaniment, but the vocal part is more declamatory and more varied. Even now it seems certain that Strauss's songs are permanent acquisitions to the repertoire. It still is too soon, however, to affirm the same thing of the unfortunate Hugo Wolf's songs, although I find myself strongly attracted by Ist's, Frühling übers Jahr, Fußreise, Der König bei der König, Gesang Weiles, Elfenlied, and Der Tambour. Saint-Saëns, Delibes, Godard, Massenet, Chaminade, and the late Auguste Holmes are among French songwriters whose work is clever, but who seem to be more concerned with manner than with matter. Gounod's rank as a song composer is much below his reputation as the composer of Faust and Romeo et Juliet. Oddly enough, however, the idea that came to him of placing a melody above a prelude from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavichord did more than anything he had accomplished up to that time to make him famous. Originally he scored it for violin with a small female chorus off stage. Then he replaced the chorus with a harmonium. Finally, he seems to have been struck with the fact that the melody fitted the words of the Ave Maria, substituted a single voice for the violin, which, however, still can supplement the vocal melody with an obbligato, did away with the harmonium, and the result was the Gounod Bach Ave Maria. The Bach prelude, of course, sinks to the level of a mere accompaniment, for it has to be taken much slower than Bach intended. American composers who have produced noteworthy songs are Edward A. MacDowell, G. W. Chadwick, Arthur Foote, Clayton Johns, Homer N. Bartlett, Margaret Ruthven Lang, and the late Ethelbert Nevin. End of Chapter 14. Songs and Song Composers. Recording by Matthew Reese, Davenport, Iowa.
Chapter 15 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.J. Carroll. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 15. Oratorio. Oratorio had its origin in an attempt by a 16th century Italian monk to make divine service more interesting. To draw to church people who might not be attracted by the opportunity to hear a sermon, but could be persuaded to come if music a trifle more entertaining to the common mind than the unaccompanied, a cappella, ecclesiastical compositions of Palestrina and other masters of the polyphonic school were thrown in with them. Music still is regarded as a prime drawing card in churches, and when nowadays a fine basso rises after the sermon and sings, "It is enough," we can paraphrase it as meaning, "It is enough so far as the sermon is concerned, and now, to make up for it, you are going to have a chance to listen to some music." When the announcement is made that such and such a well-known singer has been engaged for a church, it means that the Reverend Blank is doing just what the monk Neri did about 400 years ago, fishing for a congregation with music. As it exists today, however, oratorio has little to do with religious worship, and usually is practiced amid secular surroundings, with a female chorus in variegated evening attire and a male chorus in claw-hammers, the singers hanging more or less anxiously on the baton of the conductor. This living picture, which, so far as this country is concerned, I have, I believe, drawn in correct perspective, is so much out of keeping with the religious subjects which usually underlie the texts of oratorios, that it may account for the comparative lack of interest shown by Americans for this form of musical entertainment. It also is true, however, that in this country oratorio never has had more than half a chance. This is due to the fact that the American man is not as sensitive to music, nor musically as well educated as the American woman, the result being that the male contingent of the average American oratorio chorus is less competent than the women singers. Tenors are rare birds in any land, and rarer here apparently than elsewhere, so that in this division of our mixed choruses there is a lack of brilliancy in tone and of precision in attack. These several circumstances combine to prevent that well-balanced ensemble necessary to a satisfactory performance. An incongruous art form. Even at its best, however, oratorio is an incongruous art form, neither an opera nor a church service, but rather an attempt to design something that shall not shock people who consider it wicked to go to the opera, nor afflict with ennui those who would consider an invitation to listen to sacred music during the week an imposition. It seems peculiarly adapted to the idea of entertainment which prevails in England, where apparently any diversion, in order to be considered legal, must be more or less of a bore. Fortunately, however, there be many men of many minds, so that while, for example, one could not well draw a gloomier picture of the hereafter for a critic like Mr. Henry T. Fink than as a place where he would be obliged to hear, let me suggest, semi-weekly performances of the Messiah, the annual Christmas auditions of that work have been the financial salvation of oratorio in America. San Filippo Neri, who was born in Florence in 1515, and was the founder of the Congregation of the Fathers of the Oratory, was the originator of oratorio. In order to attract people to church, he instituted before and after the sermon dramatic and musical renderings of scenes from Scripture. It is not unlikely that the suggestion for the underlying dramatic text came from the old mystery and miracle plays, which, to say the least, were naive. In one of these, representing Noah and his family about to embark in the ark, Mrs. Noah declares that she prefers to stay behind with her worldly friends, and when at last her son Shem seizes and forces her into the ark, she retaliates by giving the worthy Noah a box on the ear. In another play of this kind, which represented the creation, a horse, pigs with rings in their noses, and a mastiff with a brass collar were brought up to Adam to name. But in one performance the mastiff spied a cow's rib bone which had been provided for the formation of Eve, grabbed it and carried it off, in spite of the efforts of the angel to whistle him back, and Eve had to be created without the aid of the rib. Primitive efforts. It is not likely that any such contretemps accompanied the performances of San Filippo's primitive oratorios, and yet it is probable that they were not only sung, but also acted with some kind of scenic setting and costumes. For Emilio del Cavaliere, a Roman composer whose oratorio La Rappresentazione dell'Anima e del Corpo, the soul and the body, was performed in February 1600 in the church of Santa Maria della Vallicella, but who died before the production, left minute directions regarding the scenery and action. In this oratorio, as in some of the other early ones, there was a ballet, which, according to its composer's directions, was to enliven certain scenes with capers, and to execute others sedately and reverentially. It was the composer Giovanni Carissimi who first introduced the narrator in oratorio, this function being to continue the action with explanatory recitatives between the numbers. In his oratorio Jephthah, there is a solo for Jephthah's daughter. Plorate colles, dolate montes, weep, ye hills, mourn, ye mountains, which has an echo for two sopranos at the end of each phrase of the melody. Alessandro Scarlatti, who developed the aria in opera, also gave more definite form to the solos in oratorio, and a more dramatic accompaniment to the recitatives which related to action, leaving the narrative recitals unaccompanied. Up to this point, in fact, oratorio and opera may be said to have developed hand in hand, but now, through the influence of German composers, and especially through their Passion music, it assumed a more distinct form. Die Auferstehung Christi, The Resurrection, by Heinrich Schütz, produced in Dresden in 1623, and his Sieben Worte Christi, The Seven Words of Christ, subjects which have been reverentially set by many German composers, are regarded as pioneer works of their kind. In the development of Passion music, much use was made of church chorales, the grand sacred melodies of the German people, which have had incalculable influence in forming the stability of character that is a distinguishing mark of the race. They are conspicuous in the Tod Jesu, a famous work by Karl Heinrich Graun, a contemporary of Bach, whose own Passion according to St. Matthew is regarded by advanced lovers of music as the greatest of all works in oratorio or quasi-oratorio style, although the English still cling to Handel. Quote, "However close the imitation or complicated the involutions of the several voices," end quote, says Rockstro in writing of Handel, quote, "we never meet with an inharmonious collision. He, Handel, seems always to have aimed at making his parts run on velvet, whereas Bach, writing on a totally different principle, evidently delighted in bringing harmony out of discord and made a point of introducing hard passing notes in order to avail himself of the pleasant effect of their ultimate resolution." End quote. The inharmonious collisions, the hard passing notes, are among the very things which make Bach so modern, since modern ears do not set much store by music that runs on velvet. Bach's Passion music. It is interesting to note that this Passion according to St. Matthew is in two parts, and that, as was the case with the oratorios of San Filippo Neri, the sermon came between. The text was prepared by Christian Friedrichs Henrici, writing under the pseudonym of Picander, and is partly dramatic, partly epic in form, with an evangelist to relate the various events in the story, but with the Lord, St. Peter, and others using their own words according to the sacred text. A double chorus is employed, sometimes representing the disciples, sometimes the infuriated populace, but always treated in dramatic fashion. At the time the Passion was written, the arias and certain of the choruses which contained meditations on the events narrated were called soliloquiae, and in singing the beautiful chorales, the congregation was expected to join. The recitatives assigned to the Saviour are accompanied by string orchestra only, and are, as Rockstro says, full of gentle dignity, while the choruses are marked by an amount of dramatic power which is remarkable when one considers that Bach never paid any attention to the most dramatic of all musical forms, the opera. The Passion according to St. Matthew, by Johann Sebastian Bach, was his greatest work and one of the greatest works of all times. It was produced for the first time at the afternoon service in the Church of St. Thomas, Leipzig, where Bach was cantor, on Good Friday, 1729, and it was 100 years before it was heard again, when it was revived by Mendelssohn in Berlin on March 12, 1829, an epoch-making performance. Strictly speaking, Passion music is not an oratorio, but a church service, and Bach actually designed his to serve as a counter-attraction to the masses performed in the Roman Church. What we understand under oratorio derived its vitality from George Frederick Handel, who was born at Halle in Lower Saxony 1685, but whose most important work was accomplished in London, where he died in 1759 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Before Handel wrote his two greatest oratorios, Israel in Egypt and The Messiah, he had, through the composition of numerous operas, mastered the principles of dramatic writing, and in his oratorios he aims, whenever the text makes it permissible, at dramatic expression. It is only necessary to recall the plague choruses in Israel in Egypt, especially the hailstone chorus and the chorus of rejoicing, quote, "The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea," end quote, or by way of contrast, the tenderly expressive melody of, quote, "As for his people, he led them forth like sheep," end quote, to realize what an adept Handel was in dramatic expression. Rockstro on Handel. Handel may, in fact, be called the founder of variety and freedom in writing for chorus. While I must confess that I do not share Rockstro's intense enthusiasm for Handel and for The Messiah, nevertheless he expresses so well the general feeling in England and the feeling on the part of those in this country who crowd the annual Christmas performances of The Messiah toward that work, that the best means of conveying an idea of what oratorio signifies to those who like it is to quote him. Referring to Handel's free and varied treatment of chorus writing, he says, quote, "He bids us behold the Lamb of God, and we feel that he has helped us to do so. He tells us that, with his stripes we are healed, and we are sensible not of the healing only, but of the cruel price at which it was purchased. And we yield him equal obedience when he calls upon us to join in his hymns of praise. Who, hearing the noble subject of 'I will sing unto the Lord,' led off by the tenors and altos, does not long to reinforce their voices with his own? Who does not feel a choking in his throat before the first bar of the Hallelujah chorus is completed, though he may be listening to it for the 100th time? Hard indeed must his heart be who can refuse to hear when Handel preaches through the voice of his chorus." End quote. The Messiah also contains two of Handel's most famous solos, "He shall feed his flock," and "I know that my Redeemer liveth." This work was performed for the first time on April 13th, 1742, at the Music Hall, Dublin, when Handel was on a visit to the Duke of Devonshire, then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. The rehearsals, at which many people were present by invitation, had aroused so much enthusiasm that those who were interested in the charitable object for which it was given requested, quote, "as a favor that the ladies who honored this performance with their presence would be pleased to come without hoops, as it would greatly increase the charity by making room for more company," end quote. Gentlemen also were requested to come without swords for the same reason. It is said that at the first London performance, when the Hallelujah chorus rang out, the king rose in his place and, followed by the entire audience, stood during the singing of the chorus, and that thus the custom, which still is observed, originated. Following Handel, Haydn in 1798, when nearly 70 years old, wrote The Creation, founded on passages from Milton's Paradise Lost, and after it The Seasons, for which Thomson's familiar poem supplied the text. In both of these there is much purely descriptive music, especially in the earlier oratorio, when the creation of various animals is related. In The Creation, too, after the passages for muted strings, is the famous outburst of orchestra and chorus, "And there was light." Haydn was a far greater master of orchestration than Handel. He also was one of the early composers of the homophonic school, and there is a freer, more spontaneous flow of melody in his oratorios, but they undoubtedly lack the grandeur of Handel's. Mendelssohn's oratorios. Between Haydn and Mendelssohn, in the development of oratorio, nothing need be mentioned excepting Beethoven's Mount of Olives and Spohr's The Last Judgment, Die letzten Dinge. Mendelssohn, in his St. Paul, followed the example of the old Passionists and introduced chorales, but in his greater oratorio Elijah, which is purely an Hebraic subject, he discarded these. The dramatic quality of Elijah is so apparent that it has been said more than once to be capable of stage representation with scenery, costumes, and action. This is especially true of the prophet himself, whose personality is so definitely developed that he stands before us almost like a character behind the footlights. This dramatic value is felt at the very beginning when, after 4 solemn chords on the brass, the work, instead of opening with an overture, is ushered in by Elijah's prophecy of the drought. Then comes the overture, which is descriptive of the effects for the prophecy. Next to the Messiah, Elijah probably is the most popular of oratorios, and I think this is due to its dramatic value and to the fact that its descriptive music, instead of being somewhat naive, not to say childish, as is the case with some passages in Haydn's Creation, is extremely effective. It is necessary only to remind the reader of the descent of the fire and the destruction of the prophets of Baal, of the description of the gradual approach of the rainstorm, as Elijah, standing on Mount Carmel and watching for the coming of the rain, is informed of the little cloud, quote, out of the sea, like a man's hand, end quote. A little cloud which we seem to see in the music, and which grows in size and blackness until it bursts like a deluge over the scene. Then there are the famous bass solo, It Is Enough, the unaccompanied trio of angels, the angel's song, O Rest in the Lord, and the tenderly expressive chorus, He, Watching Over Israel. I once heard a performance of Elijah during which the angel carried on such a lively flirtation with the prophet that she almost missed the cue for her most important solo. In fact, would have missed it, had not the conductor sharply called her attention to the fact that it was time for her to begin. I think that oratorio reached its successive climaxes with the Messiah and Elijah. Gounod's Redemption and Morse Vita, in spite of passages of undeniable beauty, seem to me as a whole rather spineless. Edward Elgar's Dream of Gerontius and the Apostles have created much excitement in England and considerable interest here, but while it is too soon to hazard a definite opinion of this composer, he appears to be lacking in individuality, to derive from Wagner whatever is interesting in his scores, while what is original with him is unimportant. There are certain sacred, semi-sacred, and even secular works that are apt to figure on the programs of oratorio and allied societies. Mr. Frank Damrosch's Society of Musical Art sings very beautifully some of the unaccompanied choruses of the early Italian polyphonic school, such as Palestrina's Pape Marcelli Mass, Stabat Mater, and Requiem, the Miserere of Allegri, sought to be retained exclusively by the choir of the Sistine Chapel, but which Mozart wrote out from memory after hearing it twice, and the Stabat Mater of Pergolesi. There are also the Bach cantatas, Mozart's Requiem, with its tragic associations, Beethoven's Mass in D, Schumann's Paradise and the Peri, and his music to Byron's Manfred, with recitation, Liszt's Graner Mass, Legend of St. Elizabeth, and Christus, Rubinstein's Tower of Babel and Paradise Lost, Brahms's German Requiem, a noble but difficult work, Dvorak's Stabat Mater, Rossini's Moses in Egypt and Stabat Mater, Berlioz's Requiem and Damnation de Faust, the American production of which latter was one of the late Dr. Leopold Damrosch's finest achievements, and Verdi's Manzoni Requiem. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of How to Appreciate Music. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in January 2011. How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe. Chapter 16. Opera and Music Drama. Opera originated in Florence toward the close of the 16th century. A band of enthusiastic intellectual composers aimed at reproducing the musical declamation which they believed to have been characteristic of the representation of Greek tragedy. The first attempt resulted in a cantata, Il Conte Ugolino, for single voice with the accompaniment of a single instrument, and composed by Vincenzo Galileo, father of the famous astronomer. Another composer, Giulio Caccini, wrote several shorter pieces in similar style. These composers aimed at an exact oratorical rendering of the words. Consequently, their scores were neither fugal nor in any other sense polyphonic, but strictly monodic. They were not, however, melodious, but declamatory, and if Richard Wagner had wished in the 19th century to claim any historical foundation for the declamatory recitative which he introduced in his music dramas, he might have fallen back upon these composers of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and through them back to Greek tragedy with its bands of lyres and flutes. These Italian composers, then, were the creators of recitative, so different from the polyphonic church music of the school of Palestrina. What usually is classed as the first opera, Jacopo Peri's Daphne, was privately performed at the Palazzo Corsi, Florence, in 1597. So great was its success that Peri was commissioned in 1600 to write a similar work for the festivities incidental to the marriage of Henry IV of France with Maria di Medici, and produced Euridice, the first Italian opera ever performed in public. The new art form received great stimulus from Claudio Monteverde, the Duke of Mantua's Maestro di Capella, who composed Arianna in honor of the marriage of Francesco Gonzaga with Margherita, Infanta of Savoy. The scene in which Ariadne bewails her desertion by her lover was so dramatically written, from the standpoint of the day, of course, that it produced a sensation. And when Monteverde brought out with even greater success his opera Orfeo, which showed a great advance in dramatic expression, as well as in the treatment of the instrumental score, the permanency of opera was assured. Monteverde's scores contained, besides recitative, suggestions of melody, but these suggestions occurred only in the instrumental ritornelles. The Venetian composer Cavalli, however, introduced melody into the vocal score in order to relieve the monotonous effect of continuous recitative, and in his airs for voice he foreshadowed the aria form, which was destined to be freely developed by Alessandro Scarlatti, who is regarded as the founder of modern Italian opera, in the form in which it flourished from his day to and including the earlier period of Verdi's activity. Melody, free and beautiful melody, soaring above a comparatively simple accompaniment, was the characteristic of Italian opera from Scarlatti's first opera, L'Onesta nell'amore, produced in Rome in 1680, to Verdi's Trovatore, produced in the same city in 1853. The names, besides Verdi's, associated with its most brilliant successes are Rossini, Il Barbiere di Siviglia, Guillaume Tell, Bellini, Norma, La Sonnambula, I Puritani, and Donizetti, Lucia, L'Élysire d'Amore, La Fille du Régiment. These composers possessed dramatic verve to a great degree, aimed straight for the mark, and when at their best, always hit the operatic target in the bull's eye. Reforms by Gluck. The charge most frequently laid against Italian opera is that its composers have been too subservient to the singers, and have sacrificed dramatic truth and depth of expression, as well as the musicianship which is required of a well-written and well-balanced score, as between the vocal and instrumental portions, to the vanity of those upon the stage. In brief, that Italian opera consists too much of showpieces for its interpreters. Among the first to protest practically against this abuse was Gluck, a German who, from copying the Italian style of operatic composition early in his career, changed his entire method as late as 1762, when he was nearly 50 years old. Orfeo et Euridice, the oldest opera that today still holds a place in the operatic repertoire, and containing the favorite air, "Ce farò senza Euridice," I have lost my Euridice, was produced by Gluck in Vienna in the year mentioned. There Gluck followed it up with Alceste, then went to Paris and scored a triumph with Iphigenie and Aulite. But on the arrival in Paris of the Italian composer Piccini, the Italian party there seized upon him as a champion to pit against Gluck, and there then ensued in the French capital a rivalry so fierce that it became a veritable musical war of the roses, until Gluck completely triumphed over Piccini with Iphigenie and Tauride. Gluck's reform of opera lay in his abandoning all effort at claptrap effect merely for its own sake, and in making his choruses as well as his soloists participants, musically and actively, in the unfolding of the dramatic story. But while he avoided senseless vocal embellishments and ceased to make a display of singers' talents the end and purpose of opera, he never hesitated to introduce beautiful melody for the voice when the action justified it. In fact, what he aimed at was dramatic truth in his music, and with this end in view he also gave greater importance to the instrumental portion of his score. Comparative popularity of certain operas. These characteristics remain for many years to come the distinguishing marks of German opera. They will be discovered in Mozart's Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Zauberflöte, which differ from Gluck's operas in not being based on heroic or classical subjects, and in exhibiting the general advance made in freer musical expression, as well as Mozart's greater spontaneity of melodic invention, his keen sense of the dramatic element, and his superior skill in orchestration. They also will be discovered in Beethoven's Fidelio, which again differs from Mozart's operas in the same degree in which the individuality of one great composer differs from that of another. With Weber's Freischütz, Euryanthe, and Oberon, German opera enters upon the Romantic period, from which it is but a step to The Flying Dutchman, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, and the music dramas of Richard Wagner. Meanwhile, the French had developed a style of opera of their own, which is represented by Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, Gounod's Faust, apparently destined to live as long as any opera that now graces the stage, and by Bizet's absolutely unique Carmen. In French opera, the instrumental support of the voices is far richer and more delicately discriminating than in Italian opera, and the whole form is more serious. It is better thought out, shows greater intellectual effort, and not such a complete abandon to absolute musical inspiration. It is true there is much claptrap in Meyerbeer, but Les Huguenots still lives, and vitality is, after all, the final test of an artwork. Unquestionably, Italian operas like Il Barbiere di Siviglia, La Sonnambula, Lucia, and Trovatore are more popular in this country than Mozart's or Weber's operatic works. In assigning reasons for this, it seems generally to be forgotten that these Italian operas are far more modern. Don Giovanni was produced in 1787, whereas Il Barbiere was brought out in 1816, La Sonnambula in 1831, Lucia in 1835, Trovatore in 1853, and Verdi's last work in operatic style, Aida, in 1871. Don Giovanni still employs the dry recitative, recitatives accompanied by simple chords on the violoncello, which is exceedingly tedious and makes the work drag at many points. In Il Barbiere, although the recitatives are musically as uninteresting, they are humorous, and, with Italian buffos, trip lightly and vivaciously from the tongue. As regards Fidelio and Der Freischütz, the amount of spoken dialogue in them is enough to keep these works off the American stage, or at least to prevent them from becoming popular here. Wagner has had far-reaching effect upon music in general, and even Italian opera, which, of all art forms, was least like his music dramas, has felt his influence. Boito's Mefistofele, Ponchielli's La Gioconda, Verdi's Otello and Falstaff are examples of the far-reaching results of Wagner's theories. Even in Aida, Verdi's more discriminating treatment of the orchestral score and his successful effort to give genuine Oriental color to at least some portions of it show that even then he was beginning to weary of the cheaper successes he had won with operas like Il Trovatore, La Traviata, and Rigoletto, and, while by no means inclined to menace his own originality by copying Wagner or by adopting his system, was willing to profit by the more serious attitude of Wagner towards his art. Puccini, in La Tosca, has written a first-act finale which is palpably constructed on Wagnerian lines. In his La Bohème, in Leoncavallo's I Pagliacci, and in Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana, The distinct efforts made to have the score reflect the characteristics of the text show Wagner's influence potent in the most modern phases of Italian opera. Humperdinck's Hänsel und Gretel and Richard Strauss' Feuersnot and Salome represent the further working out of Wagner's art form in Germany. Wagner's music dramas. I doubt whether Wagner had either the Greek drama or the declamatory recitative of the early Italian opera composers in mind when he originated the music drama. My opinion is that he thought it out free from any extraneous suggestion, but afterward, anticipating the attacks which in the dense state of music in Germany would be made upon his theories, sought for prototypes and found them in ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy. His theory of dramatic music is that it should express with undeviating fidelity the words which underlie it, not words in their mere outward aspect, but their deeper significance in their relation to the persons, controlling ideas, impulses, and passions, out of which grow the scenes, situations, climaxes, and crises of the written play, the libretto, if you so choose to call it, so long as you don't say book of the opera. For even from this brief characterization it must be patent that the music drama is not an opera, but what opera should be or would be had it not, through the Italian love of clearly defined melody and the Italian admiration for beautiful singing, become a string of solos, duets, and other numbers, written in set form to the detriment of the action. Opera is the glorification of the voice and the deification of the singer. Do we not call the prima donna a diva? Music drama, on the other hand, is the glorification of music in its broadest sense, instrumental and vocal combined, and the deification of dramatic truth on the musical stage. Opera, as handled by the Italian and the French, undoubtedly is a very attractive art form, but music drama is a higher art form, because more serious and more searching and more elevated in its expression of emotion. Wagner was German to the core, as national as Luther, says Mr. Krehbiel most aptly in his Studies in the Wagnerian Drama, which, like everything this critic writes, is the work of a thinker. For the dramas which Wagner created as the basis for his scores, he went back to legends which, if not always Teutonic in their origin, had become steeped in Germanism. The profound impression made by Wagner's artworks may be indicated by saying that the whole folklore movement dates from his activity, and that so far as Germany itself is concerned, his argument for a national artwork as well as his practical illustration of what he meant through his own music dramas gave immense impetus to the development of united Germany as manifested in the German Empire. He as well as the man of blood and iron had a share in Sedan. Wagner's first successful work, Rienzi, was an out-and-out opera in Meyerbeerian style. The Flying Dutchman already is legendary and more serious, while Tannhäuser and Lohengrin show immense technical progress, besides giving a clue to his system of leading motives, which is fully developed in the scores of The Ring of the Nibelung, Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger, and Parsifal. That his theories met with a storm of opposition, and that for many years the battle between Wagnerism and anti-Wagnerism raged with unabated vigor in the musical world, are matters of history. Whoever wishes to explore this phase of Wagner's career will find it set forth in the most interesting Wagner biography in any language, Mr. Fink's Wagner and His Works. Wagner a melodist. It sometimes is contended that Wagner adopted his system of leading motives because he was not a melodist. This is refuted by the melodies that abound in his earlier works, and, even as I write, I can hear the pupils in a nearby public school singing the melody of the Pilgrim's Chorus from Tannhäuser. Moreover, his leading motives themselves are descriptively or soulfully melodious as the requirement may be. They are brief phrases, it is true, but nonetheless they are melodies. And in certain episodes in his music dramas, when he deemed it permissible, he introduced beautiful melodies that are complete in themselves. Siegmund's love song and Wotan's farewell in Die Walküre, the love duet at the end of Siegfried, the love scene in Tristan und Isolde, the prize song in Die Meistersinger. The eloquence of the brief melodious phrases which we call leading motives, considered by themselves alone and without any reference to the dramatic situation, must be clear to anyone who has heard the funeral march in Götterdämmerung, which consists entirely of a series of leading motives that have occurred earlier in the cycle, yet give this passage an overpowering pathos, without equal in absolute music, and just as effective whether you know the story of the music drama and the significance of the motives or not. If you do know the story and the significance of these musical phrases, you will find that in this funeral march the whole ring of the Nibelung is being summoned up for you, and coming as it does near the end of Götterdämmerung, but one scene intervening between it and the final curtain, it gives a wonderful sense of unity to the whole work. Unity is, in fact, a distinguishing trait of music drama, and the very term unity suggests that certain recurring salient points in the drama, whether they be personages, ideas, or situations, should be treated musically with a certain similarity and have certain recognizable characteristics. In fact, the adaptation of music to a drama would seem to suggest association of ideas through musical unity, and to presuppose the employment of something like leading motives. They had indeed been used tentatively by Berlioz in orchestral music, and by Weber in opera, or Rianthe, but it remained for Wagner to work up the suggestion into a complete and consistent system. To illustrate this method, take the curse motive in the Ring of the Nibelung, which is heard when Alberich curses the ring, and all into whose possession it shall come. When, near the end of Rheingold, Fafner kills his brother Fasold in wresting the ring from him, the motive recurs with a significance which is readily understood. Fasold is the first victim of the curse. Again, in Götterdämmerung, when Siegfried lands at the entrance to the castle of Gibichungs and is greeted by Hagen, although the greeting seems hearty enough, the motive is heard and conveys its sinister lure. When, in Die Walküre, Brünnhilde predicts the birth of a son to Sieglinde, you hear the Siegfried motive, signifying that the child will be none other than the young hero of the next drama. The motive is heard again when Wotan promises Brünnhilde to surround her with a circle of flames which none but a hero can penetrate, Siegfried being that hero, and also when Siegfried himself, in the music drama Siegfried, tells of seeing his image in the brook. There are motives which are almost wholly rhythmical, like the Nibelung smithy motive, which depicts the slavery of the Nibelungs, eternally working in the mines of Nibelheim, and motives with strange, weird harmonies, like the motive of the Tarnhelm, which conveys a sense of mystery, the Tarnhelm giving its wearer the power to change his form. Leading motives not mere labels. Leading motives are not mere labels. They concern themselves with more than the superficial aspects of things and persons. With persons they express character, with things they symbolize what these stand for. The curse motive is weird, sinister. You feel when listening to it that it bodes evil to all who come within its dark circle. The Siegfried motive, on the other hand, is buoyant with youth, vigor, courage, vibrates with the love of achievement, and stirs the soul with its suggestion of heroism. But when you hear it in the funeral march in Götterdämmerung, and it recalls by association the gay-hearted, tender, yet courageous boy who slew the dragon, awakened Brünnhilde with his kiss, only to be betrayed and murdered by Hagen, and now is being borne over the mountain to the funeral pyre, those heroic strains have a tragic significance that almost brings tears to your eyes. The Siegfried motive is a good example of a musical phrase, the contour of which practically remains unchanged through the music drama. The varied emotions with which we listen to it are affected by association. But many of Wagner's leading motives are extremely plastic and undergo many changes in illustrating the development of character or the special bearing of certain dramatic situations upon those concerned in the action of the drama. As a gay-hearted youth, Siegfried winds his horn. This horn call becomes when, as Brünnhilde's husband, he bids farewell to his bride and departs in quest of knightly adventure, the stately motive of Siegfried, the hero. And when the dead Siegfried, stretched upon a rude bier, is borne from the scene, it voices the climax of the tragedy with overwhelming power. Thus we have two derivatives from the Siegfried horn call, each with its own special significance, yet harking back to the original germ. Soon after the opening of Tristan und Isolde, a sailor sings an unaccompanied song of farewell to his Irish maid. The words, "The wind blows freshly toward our home," are sung to an undulating phrase which seems to represent the gentle heaving of the sea. This same phrase gracefully undulates through Brangene's reply to Isolde's question as to the vessel's course, changes entirely in character, and surges savagely around her wild outburst of anger when she is told that the vessel is nearing Cornwall's shore, and breaks itself in savage fury against her despairing wrath when she invokes the elements to destroy the ship and all upon it. Examples like this occur many times in the scores of Wagner's music dramas. Often when several characters are participating in a scene, or when the act or influence of one or the principle for which he stands in a drama is potent, though he himself is not present, Wagner with rare skill combines several motives, utilizing for this purpose all the resources of counterpoint. Elsewhere I already have described how he has done this in the magic fire scene in Die Walküre, and one could add page after page of examples of this kind. I have also spoken of his supreme mastership of instrumentation, through which he gives an endless variety of tone color to his score. Wagner was a great dramatist, but he was a far greater musician. There are many splendid scenes and climaxes in the dramas which he wrote for his music, and if he had not been a composer it is possible he would have achieved immortality as a writer of tragedy. On the other hand, however, there are in his dramas many long stretches in which the action is unconsciously delayed by talk. He believed that music and drama should go hand in hand, and each be of equal interest, but his supreme musicianship has disproved his own theories, for his dramas derive the breath of life from his music. Theoretically, he is not supposed to have written absolute music, music for its own sake, but music that would be intelligible and interesting only in connection with the drama to which it was set. But the scores of the great scenes in his music dramas, played simply as instrumental selections in concert, and without the slightest clue to their meaning in their given place, constitute the greatest achievements in absolute music that history up to the present time can show. End of chapter 16. End of How to Appreciate Music by Gustav Kobbe.